The ships never saw each other, and yet the war changed forever. Across a vast stretch of open ocean, far from any coastline worth naming, two fleets moved blindly toward collision. There would be no line of battle, no broadsides exchanged at visual range, no moment when commanders could point and say there. Decisions would be made from maps, radio reports, and fleeting signals, and the consequences would unfold hundreds of miles away, carried by aircraft alone. This was the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle in history fought without the opposing fleets ever seeing one another. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific War was tilting dangerously. Japanese forces had surged outward with speed and confidence, seizing territory and threatening to isolate Australia from the United States. Their next objective was clear: extend control southward, cut supply lines, and force the Allies into a defensive corner they might never escape. To stop that, the Allies had only one option: carriers. This battle would be decided not by armor thickness or gunnery skill, but by flight decks, pilot training, coordination, and the ability to find the enemy first. It was warfare at distance, fragile, fast, and unforgiving. On one side stood the Imperial Japanese Navy, experienced, confident, and aggressive. Its carrier pilots had already proven themselves in earlier victories. On the other stood the United States Navy, still recovering from earlier losses, still learning how to fight a carrier war under pressure. Neither side had certainty. Search aircraft flew long, empty patterns over endless sea. Radio messages arrived incomplete or too late. Intelligence was fragmentary and often misleading. And yet, when contact was finally made, everything accelerated at once. Aircraft rose from decks before dawn. Strike groups crossed paths unseen. Bombs fell on targets identified by instinct and guesswork. Mistakes were fatal. Coordination failures cost ships. Attacks that missed by minutes spared fleets. And when hits landed, they landed hard. Carriers burned. Flight decks were torn apart. Aircraft were lost not only to enemy fire, but to fuel exhaustion over open water with nowhere to land. The USS Lexington would be lost, not immediately, but through cascading damage that turned success into sacrifice. Japanese carriers were damaged badly enough to withdraw, their decks battered and their air groups depleted. And that was the point where the battle revealed its true meaning. Tactically, the outcome was unclear. Ships were sunk on both sides, losses were heavy. But strategically, everything had changed. The Japanese advance toward Australia was stopped. Their carrier strength was weakened at a critical moment. Momentum, once unquestioned, was interrupted. The Battle of the Coral Sea mattered not because it ended something, but because it prevented something worse. It showed that Japan could be checked. That carrier warfare favored coordination over audacity, and that the Pacific War would be decided not by who struck first, but by who could sustain pressure over time. It was also a rehearsal. Lessons learned here would echo weeks later in a battle even larger, even more decisive. Pilots, commanders, and staffs would carry Coral Sea forward, refining tactics, correcting errors, and preparing for a future already rushing toward them. This battle reminds us that turning points are not always obvious in the moment. Sometimes they look like stalemates, sometimes they feel like loss. Sometimes they are recognized only in hindsight, when what did not happen proves more important than what did. Tonight we return to that empty ocean, to the radar plots and flight decks, to the pilots who flew toward enemies they could not see, to the battle that proved the Pacific War would be fought in the air, over water, far beyond the horizon. This is the story of the Battle of the Coral Sea. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now, and what time is it for you there? Is this a late-night listen, an early morning start, or a quiet moment carved out just to sit with history? And if these long, immersive journeys into the past help you slow down, reflect, or truly understand how history turns on decisions made far from the spotlight, I hope you'll consider subscribing. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the Battle of the Coral Sea, April 18, 1940, To Commander Edwin Layton stood in Admiral Chester Nimitz's office at Pearl Harbor, holding a stack of decoded intercepts that made his hands shake. The basement cryptanalysts had been working 20-hour shifts for days, piecing together fragments of Japanese naval communications like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. What they'd found terrified him. A major operation was coming, designated only by the letters MO, and it involved at least 2 aircraft carriers moving toward the Southwest Pacific. Layton watched Nimitz's face as he delivered the news, searching for some sign that the admiral understood what this meant, that America's threadbare Pacific Fleet would have to face the same navy that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 5 months earlier. The Coral Sea stretched across 1.85 million square kilometers of the Southwest Pacific, an expanse of ocean larger than Alaska. Few Americans had heard of it in early 1942. The waters were treacherous, studded with uncharted reefs that had torn open the hulls of unwary ships for centuries. The weather changed without warning, violent squalls appearing from nowhere to blind pilots and scatter formations. But geography gave this remote stretch of ocean an importance that outweighed its obscurity. Between the Coral Sea and Australia lay barely 500 miles of water. Between the Coral Sea and Japanese-held Rabaul, even less. Whoever controlled these waters controlled whether Australia would remain an Allied stronghold or become an isolated continent, cut off and vulnerable. Neither side fully understood the stakes yet, but they were about to learn. In Tokyo, Japanese naval planners spread maps across conference tables and traced routes with careful precision. Operation MO represented the next logical step in their campaign of Pacific conquest. Since December 1940, Japanese forces had swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, capturing more territory in 5 months than Napoleon had conquered in a decade. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Establish a defensive perimeter so vast that America would exhaust itself trying to break through, then negotiate a favorable peace from a position of strength. Port Moresby, a small Australian outpost on the southern coast of New Guinea, had become essential to this vision. From airfields at Port Moresby, Japanese bombers could reach every major city in northeastern Australia. The Imperial General Headquarters approved the operation in early April. 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, would provide air cover for the invasion force. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out, depended on secrets neither side knew the other possessed. In a cramped basement beneath the administrative building at Pearl Harbor, a team of cryptanalysts and linguists worked in a space officially designated as Station WIPO. Their mission was to break Japanese naval code JN-25, a cipher system using roughly 45,000 code groups that changed periodically to frustrate enemy code breakers. Commander Joseph Rochefort led this effort, a brilliant cryptanalyst who wore a smoking jacket and slippers to work because he claimed they helped him think. His team had managed to break perhaps 15 to 20% of JN-25 by late April, enough to detect that something major was brewing, but not enough to know precisely what. The intercepts mentioned Port Moresby. They mentioned carriers. They mentioned early May. Rochefort believed he knew what Operation MO meant, but could he prove it to Nimitz with only 60% certainty? Admiral Nimitz faced an agonizing decision that would have broken lesser commanders. The Pacific Fleet had exactly 3 operational aircraft carriers after Pearl Harbor: USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Yorktown. Against them, Japan could field 10 fleet carriers staffed by veteran air crews who had trained for years before the war. The carrier represented the new capital ship of naval warfare, replacing the battleship as the dominant force at sea, yet doctrine for using them remained primitive and untested. No 2 carriers had ever fought each other in history. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Commit the carriers to stop Operation MO and risk losing them to a superior force. Hold them back and watch Port Moresby fall, potentially isolating Australia and losing the war's southern anchor. Nimitz studied Layton's intelligence summary, asked pointed questions about confidence levels and source reliability, then made his choice. Task Force 17, built around Yorktown and Lexington, would deploy to the Coral Sea immediately. They would intercept the Japanese invasion force. They would stop Operation Amo, or they would die trying. The crews of Yorktown and Lexington had no illusions about what they faced. These were not the same sailors who had peacefully manned Pacific Fleet ships in the lazy days before Pearl Harbor. They were veterans now, hardened by 5 months of desperate warfare and narrow escapes. Lexington herself, affectionately known as Lady Lex to her crew of nearly 3,000 men, had been commissioned in 1927 as one of America's first fleet carriers. She displaced 48,000 tons fully loaded and could carry more than 90 aircraft. Her pre-war construction made her irreplaceable. American shipyards wouldn't deliver new carriers until 1943 at the earliest. Yorktown was slightly smaller but newer, completed in 1937 as part of the pre-war expansion. Together, these two ships represented 40% of America's entire Pacific carrier strength. Loading them with bombs, torpedoes, aviation fuel, and provisions in late April, the sailors worked with the grim efficiency of men who understood they might not come home. Across the Pacific, a different kind of preparation unfolded with equal intensity, but far greater confidence. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi commanded the MO striking force, built around carriers Shokaku and Zuiku, sister ships completed in 1941. As the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, these were modern carriers, fast and powerful, carrying over 70 aircraft each. Their air groups were staffed by pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, sunk British battleships off Malaya, and devastated Allied forces throughout the East Indies. Japanese naval aviators trained for 3 years or more before being assigned to carriers, creating an elite force of extraordinary skill. The Zero fighter pilots considered themselves invincible, and with good reason. Their Mitsubishi A6M Claude outperformed every Allied fighter in the Pacific in speed, range, and maneuverability. When Shokaku and Zukaku departed Truck Lagoon on May 2nd, their crews anticipated another easy victory against the battered Americans. But something had changed in the waters of the Coral Sea that neither side fully grasped yet. This would not be like the old decisive naval battles of history, where opposing fleets closed to gun range and pounded each other until one side fled or sank. The carrier introduced a new paradigm that neither Japan nor America had truly mastered. These ships fought without ever seeing each other, launching aircraft that flew hundreds of miles to attack targets over the horizon. Finding the enemy became as important as fighting them. Weather, communication failures, navigation errors, all could scatter a carefully planned operation into chaos. The Coral Sea was about to become a laboratory for this new kind of warfare, and the lessons would be written in blood and burning ships. On May 3rd, Japanese forces landed at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, securing a seaplane base as the first phase of Operation Mo. The invasion met no resistance. Australian coast watchers, hidden observers scattered throughout the Pacific Islands, sent urgent radio reports back to Allied headquarters. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 from Yorktown, received the news and made an aggressive decision. He would strike Tulagi immediately, even though it meant revealing his position to the Japanese. On May 4th at dawn, Yorktown launched 3 waves of strikes against the Tulagi anchorage. American dive bombers and torpedo planes caught Japanese ships by surprise, sinking a destroyer, 3 minesweepers, and damaging several other vessels. The tactical results were modest, no major ships destroyed. But the psychological impact rippled outward. The Japanese now knew American carriers were in the area. The Americans had announced their presence with violence. The stage was set for collision. Neither commander knew where his opponent was, but both knew they were circling each other like blind wrestlers in a dark room. Fletcher had Lexington and Yorktown. Takagi had Shokaku and Zuikaku. Somewhere in between sailed the Port Moresby invasion convoy, protected by light carrier Shoho and several cruisers. The Coral Sea covered over 1 million square kilometers, and carrier aircraft could search perhaps 200 miles in any direction before fuel limitations forced them back. The odds of 2 fleets stumbling across each other by accident were minuscule. This battle would be decided by reconnaissance, by the scout pilots who flew lonely patrols over empty ocean, hoping to glimpse smoke on the horizon or the white wake of a distant ship. May 5th and 6th passed with both forces maneuvering south of the Solomon Islands, searching but not finding. Tension mounted hour by hour. Every dawn brought the possibility of discovery. Every dusk brought relief tinged with frustration. The invisible enemy was out there somewhere, and finding them first meant the difference between delivering a devastating first strike and receiving one. Late April 1940-2, the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor smelled of cigarette smoke, sweat, and stale coffee. Commander Joseph Rochefort sat at a desk piled high with intercept sheets, his trademark smoking jacket hanging loose over his shoulders. Eyes bloodshot from another 20-hour shift. Around him, dozens of cryptanalysts hunched over adding machines and index card files, searching for patterns and streams of seemingly random numbers. This was Station Hippo, the most important basement in the Pacific War. These men weren't fighting with guns or torpedoes. They were fighting with mathematics and linguistics, trying to break into the encrypted communications of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The fate of nations would turn on whether they succeeded. Japanese Naval Code JN 25 represented one of the most sophisticated encryption systems in the world at that time. The system used a code book containing roughly 45,000 five-digit code groups, each representing a word, phrase, or concept. A message would first be encoded using the code book, then those code groups would be enciphered by adding random numbers from a separate additive book. The result looked like gibberish, streams of five-digit numbers with no apparent pattern. Breaking JN 25 required recovering both the codebook meanings and the additive tables, a task that seemed almost impossible. The Japanese changed the additives periodically and introduced new codebooks every few months. Hippo had been working on JN 25 since before Pearl Harbor, making slow, frustrating progress. By late April 1940, Rochefort's team had recovered perhaps 15 to 20% of the codebook and could read fragments of intercepted messages. It was enough to know something big was coming, but not enough to be certain what. The breakthrough came in pieces scattered across dozens of intercepts during the last week of April. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, one of Rochefort's key cryptanalysts, noticed an unusual spike in radio traffic from Japanese 4th Fleet headquarters at Rabaul. Certain code groups appeared repeatedly, designations for carrier divisions, references to invasion forces, and a mysterious two-letter geographical designator that appeared again and again, RZP. Graphic analysis, the art of studying communication patterns rather than content, told its own story. The call signs of carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku appeared in messages originating from Truk Lagoon. The volume of communication suggested a major operation involving multiple task forces, coordinated across hundreds of miles. Ham Wright, a linguist who'd lived in Japan before the war, worked on recovering the meanings of geographical designators. He believed RZP meant Port Moresby, though he couldn't prove it with certainty. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. Rochefort faced a dilemma that every intelligence officer dreads. When do you report your findings to commanders who will make life-or-death decisions based on your analysis? Wait too long and the information arrives too late to be useful. Report too early with insufficient confidence, and you might send the fleet chasing phantoms, wasting precious fuel and leaving real threats undetected. On May 1st, Rochefort climbed the stairs from his basement warren to brief Admiral Nimitz. He laid out what Hippo had found. Operation Mo involved at least 2 fleet carriers, probably Shokaku and Zuikaku. The objective appeared to be Port Moresby. The timing would be early May, probably within the next week. Confidence level, 60%. Nimitz listened carefully, asked precise questions about source reliability and alternative interpretations, then made his decision. 60% was good enough. Task Force 17 would proceed to the Coral Sea. Rochefort went back to his basement, knowing that if he was wrong, American carriers might sail into a trap. The work intensified as May began. Hippo operated on adrenaline and coffee, processing hundreds of intercepts per day. The Japanese were prolific radio users, and every message represented another potential piece of the puzzle. Cryptanalysts worked in shifts but rarely left the building, catching sleep on cots between decryption sessions. The pressure was immense. These weren't abstract mathematical exercises. These were real messages coordinating real ships carrying real bombs toward real targets. Every code group recovered might reveal a piece of information that saved American lives. The younger cryptanalysts, many barely out of college, learned to function on 3 or 4 hours of sleep, sustained by the knowledge that their work mattered more than physical comfort. What made Hippo successful wasn't just cryptanalytic brilliance, though. They had plenty of that. The real secret was the integration of different intelligence disciplines into a coherent picture. Cryptanalysis broke the codes, traffic analysis studied communication patterns, direction finding plotted the geographical locations of radio transmitters. Photo reconnaissance provided visual confirmation when possible. Human intelligence from coast watchers and other sources added ground truth. Rochefort's genius lay in synthesizing all these sources into actionable intelligence. A single intercept might be meaningless, but when combined with traffic analysis showing increased communications from a particular fleet, direction finding placing that fleet near the Solomons, and coast watcher reports of ships heading south, suddenly a pattern emerged. The Japanese were approaching the Coral Sea in force, and Hippo could track them. On May 3rd, Station Hippo intercepted Japanese communications indicating that the Tulagi landing had proceeded successfully. Fletcher's strike on May 4th generated another burst of Japanese radio traffic. Angry, urgent messages as commanders realized American carriers were in the area. Rochefort's team worked feverishly to decrypt these new intercepts, hoping for precise locations. They got something even better. Indications that the Japanese were as surprised by the American presence as the Americans were eager to find the Japanese. Neither side had perfect intelligence. Both were groping in the fog of war. But Hippo had given the Americans a crucial advantage. They'd known Operation Mo was coming before it began. The Japanese had no idea American codebreakers were reading their mail. The cryptanalytic battle wasn't limited to reading enemy communications. The Japanese had their own signals intelligence units working to break American codes. Fortunately for the U.S. Navy, American cryptographic security was significantly better than their tactical performance in those early months of the war. American naval codes remained secure throughout the war. The Japanese could use traffic analysis to detect American ship movements based on radio activity, but they couldn't read the content of messages. This asymmetry proved decisive. When Admiral Fletcher maneuvered his task force, Japanese commanders might detect increased radio traffic suggesting American carriers were nearby, but they didn't know Fletcher's intentions or exact positions. Meanwhile, Rochefort could read enough of Japanese communications to provide Fletcher with strategic warning and operational intelligence. By May 7th, Hippo had built a comprehensive picture of Operation Mo's structure. The main invasion force was approaching Port Moresby from the north, protected by light carrier Shoho and several cruisers. The MO striking force with Shokaku and Zuikaku was approaching from the east to provide distant cover. Japanese commanders believed Fletcher's carriers were somewhere in the area, but didn't have precise locations. Fletcher knew the Japanese were coming, but not exactly where they were. The stage was set for the first carrier battle in history, a battle that would be fought with incomplete information on both sides. Rochefort and his team had done everything possible to give the Americans an edge. Now it was up to the pilots and gunners to execute. The code breakers could only watch and wait, hoping their intelligence would prove accurate and that the sacrifices demanded of Task Force 17 would not be in vain. The work in Hippo's basement would continue throughout the battle and beyond, providing near real-time intelligence as the action unfolded. But the fundamental achievement was already complete. Rochefort's team had detected Operation Mo early enough for Nimitz to position his forces. They'd identified the Japanese objective. They'd confirmed that at least 2 enemy carriers were involved. This intelligence made the Battle of the Coral Sea possible. Without it, Fletcher's task force might have been refueling hundreds of miles away when the Japanese struck Port Moresby. Or worse, the Americans might have sailed unknowingly into a trap with superior Japanese forces waiting in ambush. The war fought in basements had strategic consequences as profound as any fought with bombs and torpedoes. And the men who fought it would never receive the recognition they deserved, because acknowledging their success would reveal to the Japanese that their codes had been broken. May 1st, 1942, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher stood on the bridge of USS Yorktown reading the dispatch from Pearl Harbor that would determine whether he lived or died in the coming week. The message was terse, as urgent communications always were. Proceed Coral Sea maximum speed. Intercept enemy operation against Port Moresby, Task Force 11 joining from Pearl. Fletcher was 56 years old, a Naval Academy graduate who'd commanded destroyers in World War I. He understood what these orders meant. Nimitz was committing America's entire available carrier strength in the South Pacific to a desperate gamble based on fragmentary intelligence. If the intelligence was wrong, or if the Japanese force proved larger than estimated, Task Force 17 might cease to exist. There would be no reinforcements, no second chances. Fletcher ordered Yorktown to come about on a course that would take them 3,500 miles southwest. The race was on. USS Lexington was already steaming toward the rendezvous from her patrol station east of New Guinea. Built on a battlecruiser hull and commissioned in 1927, Lady Lex was one of America's first aircraft carriers and one of the largest ships afloat. She carried a crew of nearly 3,000 men and could embark more than 90 aircraft when fully loaded. Her nickname reflected genuine affection from sailors who considered her a lucky ship. She'd survived multiple close calls since Pearl Harbor. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch commanded Task Force 11 from Lexington's flag bridge, and he was deeply skeptical of the intelligence suggesting Japanese carriers were approaching. The Pacific was enormous. Finding an enemy fleet was like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. But orders were orders. On May 2nd, Fitch's task force altered course to meet Fletcher's, combining America's available striking power into a single formation. The rendezvous occurred on May 3rd in waters south of the Solomon Islands. Yorktown and Lexington, steaming in company with 2 heavy cruisers and 5 destroyers, represented a task force that looked impressive on paper, but was desperately outnumbered by the combined Japanese naval forces in the Pacific. Fletcher assumed tactical command of the combined force, designated Task Force 17. The Americans had one critical advantage. They knew approximately where the Japanese were heading. Port Moresby lay to the west. The invasion force would have to approach from the north, sailing around the eastern tip of New Guinea. If Fletcher positioned his carriers correctly, he could intercept, but the Japanese carriers that worried him, Shokaku and Zuikaku, could be anywhere in 1,000,000 square kilometers of ocean. Find them first and deliver a devastating strike. Let them find you first and die. While Fletcher's carriers converged, the Japanese were executing their own precisely choreographed movements. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi commanded the MO striking force from heavy cruiser Myoko, though operational control of the carriers rested with Rear Admiral Tadaichi Hara, an experienced naval aviator who flew his flag from Zuikaku. The 2 carriers had departed Truk Lagoon on May 2nd, steaming south into waters they expected to control unopposed. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive action and decisive battle. Takagi's orders were to cover the Port Moresby invasion force by destroying any American ships that attempted to interfere. Intelligence suggested American carriers might be in the area. Yorktown's strike on Tulagi had confirmed their presence, but Japanese commanders remained confident. They had superior numbers, superior aircraft, and crews that had been winning every battle since Pearl Harbor. What did they have to fear? May 3rd brought the first blood of the campaign, though not in the way anyone expected. Japanese forces landed at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, establishing a seaplane base that would extend their reconnaissance capabilities. The landing met no resistance. Australian coast watchers, hidden in the hills, sent radio reports to Allied headquarters, but no Allied forces were positioned to interfere. Fletcher received the news aboard Yorktown and made an aggressive decision that would later spark controversy. Rather than waiting to concentrate his full strength, he detached Yorktown from the main body and raced north to strike Tulagi. The decision reflected Fletcher's aggressive instincts, but also revealed the fog of war that would dominate the coming battle. He believed the Tulagi force represented a significant target, In reality, it was a minor sideshow. Yorktown launched 3 waves of strikes against Tulagi on May 4th at dawn. The attacks achieved tactical surprise, catching Japanese ships at anchor in the harbor. American dive bombers screamed down through anti-aircraft fire to plant bombs on destroyers and minesweepers. Torpedo planes skimmed low over the water, launching Mark 13 torpedoes that ran true for once. When the smoke cleared, 1 Japanese destroyer, 3 minesweepers, and several smaller craft had been sunk or damaged. The Americans lost 3 aircraft. Fletcher pulled Yorktown away and raced south to rejoin Lexington. The raid's tactical results were modest. No major ships destroyed, the seaplane base still operational, but the strategic consequences rippled outward. Japanese commanders now knew with certainty that American carriers were operating in the Coral Sea. The element of surprise, such as it was, had been lost. Both sides knew a collision was inevitable. The next 2 days became an exercise in blind maneuvering, as both fleets searched for each other across empty ocean. Scout planes launched at dawn, flying radial search patterns that extended 200 miles or more from the carriers. Finding nothing, they returned after 4 or 5 hours, and new scouts launched to search different sectors. This was the reality of carrier warfare in 1942. Hours of tedious searching, punctuated by brief moments of terror when contact was made. Fletcher had better intelligence about Japanese movements thanks to Station Hypo's intercepts, but intelligence wasn't omniscient. The intercepts were often hours old by the time they were decoded and transmitted to the fleet. Japanese ships could travel 100 miles while a message was being processed. Fletcher maneuvered his task force south of the Louisiades, positioning to intercept the Port Moresby invasion force while staying far enough east to avoid being trapped against the New Guinea coast. Takagi's force approached from the northeast, hampered by weather that would prove both blessing and curse. Heavy cloud cover and rain squalls reduced visibility to a few thousand yards in places, making air searches nearly impossible. But the same weather concealed the Japanese carriers from American scouts. On May 5th and 6th, scout planes from both sides crisscrossed the Coral Sea, sometimes passing within 50 miles of enemy carriers without seeing them through the clouds. Navigation remained primitive. Pilots used dead reckoning, judging their position by compass heading, airspeed, and elapsed time. Errors accumulated. A pilot might think he'd searched a sector thoroughly when in fact he'd drifted 20 miles off course and missed the enemy entirely. Both Fletcher and Takagi knew they were close to contact, but neither could find the other. The tension was unbearable. May 6th brought the task force's most critical decision point yet. Oiler USS Neosho, escorted by destroyer USS Sims, was sent south to a designated refueling point where they would wait while the carriers went hunting for the Japanese. This wasn't merely a logistical necessity. It was a calculated risk. Operating at the extreme limit of their range from Pearl Harbor, Fletcher's carriers needed regular refueling to maintain station. But sending Neosho away reduced Task Force 17's defensive anti-aircraft strength, and put 2 ships alone in waters that might contain Japanese submarines or aircraft. The oiler and her escort steamed away into the empty sea, carrying thousands of tons of fuel oil that would be useless if the carriers were sunk before rendezvous. Fletcher watched them go with an uneasy feeling. The pieces were moving into position. Tomorrow would bring contact. Tomorrow would bring battle. Tomorrow, some of these ships and men would not survive. May 7th, 1940 700 hours. Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph G. Smith sat in the cramped cockpit of his Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, warming the engine, while Yorktown's flight deck crew made final checks. The dawn search mission was routine. Fly west for 200 miles, search the assigned sector, return and report. But this morning felt different. Intelligence suggested Japanese ships were somewhere in the area, and every pilot knew that whoever found the enemy first would determine who lived and who died. Smith tested his controls, checked his fuel gauges, and ran through the pre-flight checklist one more time. Behind him sat his radio man gunner, whose job was to operate the radio and man the single .30 caliber machine gun that represented the Devastator's pathetic defensive armament. They were flying a 300-mile-per-hour death trap into waters that might contain 0 fighters capable of 400 miles per hour. Smith tried not to think about it. The search patterns launched from both carrier forces at dawn revealed the primitive state of naval aviation doctrine in 1942. Yorktown and Lexington sent out scouts in radial patterns, covering sectors from due north to due south, extending roughly 250 miles from the task force. Each aircraft searched a wedge-shaped sector, flying outbound on one bearing, then returning on a slightly different bearing to cover maximum area. The math was unforgiving. A carrier task force occupied perhaps 10 square miles when concentrated. The area to be searched covered roughly 200,000 square miles. A scout pilot could easily fly within 50 miles of an enemy carrier and never see it through cloud cover or haze. The odds of successful detection were poor. Everything depended on luck, persistence, and the skill of observers straining their eyes toward the horizon, looking for the telltale signs: smoke, wakes, the glint of sun on metal. 0730 hours brought the first sighting report, and it was catastrophically wrong. A Japanese scout plane from carrier Zukaku spotted ships roughly 160 miles south of the main Japanese force. The pilot transmitted an urgent contact report. One carrier, one cruiser, bearing south. Rear Admiral Hara, commanding the carrier division, immediately began preparing a full strike. Every available dive bomber and torpedo plane escorted by Zero fighters. The pilot had seen USS Neosho and her escort destroyer Sims, and his identification was completely mistaken. Neosho, a fleet oiler, did have a large flat structure that might be confused with a carrier's flight deck from high altitude. Sims was indeed a destroyer, but could hardly be confused with a cruiser by any competent observer. Yet in the fog of war, with adrenaline pumping and orders demanding immediate reporting, the scout pilot's error set in motion events that would doom 2 American ships. Meanwhile, American scouts were conducting their own searches with similarly imperfect results. At 0815, a scout plane from Yorktown transmitted a contact report that electrified Fletcher's flag bridge, 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers, bearing northwest. The location placed these carriers roughly 200 miles from Task Force 17, well within striking range. Fletcher immediately ordered both carriers to prepare full deck load strikes. Every available aircraft was armed with bombs or torpedoes, fueled, and spotted on the flight decks for launch. This was it, the moment they'd been hunting for. But the scout's identification was as flawed as the Japanese report that morning. He'd found the Port Moresby invasion force, which included light carrier Shoho and several cruisers. Shoho was indeed a carrier, but she carried only 30 aircraft and was significantly smaller than fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. As for the 4 heavy cruisers, some were actually heavy cruisers, but the identification was inflated by the scouts' understandable excitement at finding any enemy ships. The consequences of these identification errors would play out across the next few hours with deadly precision. At 0900 hours, Japanese aircraft located USS Neosho and USS Sims. 15 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers screamed down through broken clouds, targeting the 2 isolated ships. Neosho's crew watched in horror as the first bombs fell. The destroyer Sims, with her thin armor and loaded with depth charges and torpedoes, took 15 direct bomb hits in rapid succession. She broke in half and sank within minutes, taking all but 15 of her 379 crew members. Neosho fought back desperately with her few anti-aircraft guns, but she was built for carrying fuel, not fighting battles. Multiple bombs struck home, rupturing fuel tanks and starting fires. The ship didn't sink immediately. Her subdivided hull kept her afloat, drifting helplessly for 4 more days before being scuttled. Of her crew of 293, 123 would die from wounds, exposure, and the brutal equatorial sun during those 4 days adrift. While Japanese aircraft were destroying Neosho and Sims in a case of mistaken identity, American aircraft were approaching the Port Moresby invasion force with lethal intent. 93 aircraft from Lexington and Yorktown, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and escort fighters found the invasion force at approximately 1000 hours. The Japanese had combat air patrol Zeros overhead, but not enough to stop the massive American strike. The Americans' real target was Shoho, the light carrier providing air cover for the invasion convoy. She had no chance. The strike coordinator, Lieutenant Commander Bob Dixon, watched as his aircraft achieved what naval aviators dreamed about: multiple simultaneous attacks that overwhelmed the target's defenses. Dive bombers hit Shoho first, bomb after bomb penetrating her thin flight deck and exploding in the hangars below where fully fueled and armed aircraft detonated in sympathetic explosions. Torpedo planes followed, their Mark 13 torpedoes running true for once, a rare occurrence with that notoriously unreliable weapon. Geysers erupted along Shoho's hull as torpedoes struck below the waterline, tearing open her machinery spaces and flooding her engine rooms. The carrier shuddered to a halt, dead in the water, flames pouring from massive rents in her hull and superstructure. Within 30 minutes of the first bomb hit, Shoho capsized and sank, taking 638 men with her. Lieutenant Commander Dixon, circling overhead and counting the hits, transmitted what would become one of the most famous radio calls of the Pacific War. Scratch 1 flat top. The message reached Fletcher aboard Yorktown at 11:35. The Americans had sunk their first Japanese carrier. The celebration was premature. The sinking of Shoho sent shockwaves through Japanese command. Admiral Inoue, commanding Operation MO from Rabaul, immediately ordered the Port Moresby invasion convoy to turn back and wait for further orders. Without Shoho's air cover, the troop transports were sitting ducks for American land-based bombers or carrier strikes. The invasion, the entire objective of Operation MO, was postponed. But the MO striking force, with Shokaku and Zuikaku, remained at large, undamaged and eager for revenge. Japanese scout planes had failed to find the American carriers all morning, and now Takagi wanted blood. He ordered continuous searches throughout the afternoon. His carriers were out there somewhere, and when he found them, he would make the Americans pay for Shoho. Fletcher faced his own difficult decisions. He'd sunk one carrier and scattered the invasion force, achieving a tactical success. But his real threat, the Japanese fleet carriers, remained unlocated. His aircraft had expended most of their ordnance, sinking Shoho. Recoveries were underway, aircraft being refueled and rear-mined, but the task force was vulnerable during flight operations. If Japanese scouts found them now, before his strike aircraft were ready to launch again, Lexington and Yorktown might suffer the same fate as Shoho. The afternoon dragged on with both sides launching continuous searches, scouts crisscrossing empty ocean looking for enemies that remained stubbornly invisible. As the sun sank toward the western horizon, Fletcher knew tomorrow would bring decisive battle. Both carrier forces were within 200 miles of each other. Tomorrow's dawn searches would almost certainly achieve contact. Tomorrow would determine whether Operation Mo succeeded or failed, whether Australia remained secure or came under threat, whether Task Force 17 survived or joined the list of ships lost in a war that America was still learning how to fight. May 8th, 1942, 0600 hours. The sky over the Coral Sea lightened from black to gray, revealing scattered clouds at 4,000 feet and occasional rain squalls that reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. Aboard USS Yorktown, pilots stumbled from their ready rooms toward the flight deck, pulling on flight suits and Mae West life preservers, mentally preparing for what every man knew would come today. The Japanese carriers had to be close. Yesterday's action had brought contact with the invasion force, but the real threat, Shokaku and Zuikaku, remained unlocated. Admiral Fletcher ordered dawn searches launched at 0600, 18 scout aircraft fanning out to cover the sectors most likely to contain enemy carriers. Behind them, strike aircraft were armed with bombs and torpedoes, fueled and spotted on deck, ready to launch the moment scouts transmitted a contact report. The waiting was nearly unbearable. 0820 hours. The radio crackled with a transmission Fletcher had been dreading and hoping for simultaneously. Scout aircraft from Lexington had found them. 2 carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, multiple destroyers, bearing 020 degrees, distance 175 miles. The position placed the Japanese almost exactly northeast of Task Force 17, well within striking range. Fletcher didn't hesitate. Launch everything. Within minutes, both carriers erupted into carefully controlled chaos as flight deck crews rushed to launch the maximum possible strike. Yorktown's first aircraft roared down the deck at 0900 hours. Lexington followed immediately after. 82 aircraft total, 15 Wildcat fighters for combat air patrol over the task force, with the remainder, 36 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 22 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 9 more Wildcats as strike escorts, forming up in the morning sky before setting course northeast toward glory or death. What neither Fletcher nor his pilots knew was that at almost the same moment, 170 miles away, Japanese carriers were launching their own maximum strike against the Americans. A Japanese scout had finally located Task Force 17 at 0802 hours, just 2 minutes after the American contact report. Rear Admiral Hara ordered immediate launch from Shokaku and Zuikaku. 69 aircraft took to the air, 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, 33 Aichi D3A Val dive bombers, and 18 Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo bombers. The two strike forces passed each other en route to their targets, American aircraft heading northeast, while Japanese aircraft flew southwest, sometimes within a few miles of each other, but neither seeing the other through broken clouds. It was the most perfectly balanced carrier exchange in history. Two strike forces of roughly equal strength launched simultaneously to attack two carrier forces of roughly equal capability. Whoever struck first and struck hardest would win. The American strike found Shokaku first at approximately 10:57 hours. The Japanese carrier was steaming at high speed, her escorts arrayed in a protective ring, combat air patrol 0 circling overhead. The strike coordinator, Lieutenant Commander William Birch, ordered the dive bombers to attack while torpedo planes set up for their slower, more vulnerable approach. The dauntless dive bombers pushed over from 12,000 feet, screaming down at a 60-degree angle, with wind shrieking through their dive brakes. Japanese anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black puffs, and 0 fighters dove through the formation, trying to break up the attack. But the dive bomber pilots held steady, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs at 2,000 feet before pulling out so hard that gray mist formed along their wings from the G-forces. The first bomb hit Shokaku's flight deck amidships, penetrating through to the hangar deck where it detonated among parked aircraft. Aviation fuel ignited. Secondary explosions rippled through the hangar. A second bomb hit near the forward elevator, and a third struck close to the stern. Shokaku staggered under the impacts, slowing, burning, her flight deck torn open and useless. But Zuikaku escaped completely. The second Japanese carrier had entered a weather front, heavy rain and low clouds that made her invisible to American scouts. The torpedo planes searched desperately for her, flying through rain squalls that reduced visibility to 0, but she'd vanished. Eventually, with fuel running low and unable to find the second carrier, the American aircraft turned for home. They damaged Shokaku badly. Later reports would confirm 3 direct bomb hits, 108 men killed, and flight deck damage that would require 2 months of repair in Japanese shipyards. But Zuikaku remained operational with full aircraft complement, and she was still hunting. The Japanese found Lexington and Yorktown at almost exactly the same time the Americans were hitting Shokaku. Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi led the Japanese strike, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major operation since. He brought his formation in from the south, approaching at altitude to avoid early detection. American radar picked them up at approximately 68 miles, giving Fletcher precious minutes to prepare. He ordered all available Wildcat fighters to intercept, and both carriers turned into the wind to launch additional fighters. Combat Air Patrol F-4F Wildcats climbed desperately toward the incoming raid, but there weren't enough. Never enough. The Japanese formation was simply too large. Some Vals and Kates were shot down by the defending fighters, but most got through. At 1100 hours, the Japanese attack began. Val dive bombers struck first, coming down in the same steep dives that American pilots used, bombs whistling through anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with exploding shells. Lexington's massive hull made her an easy target. Two bombs hit Lady Lex within seconds, smashing through her flight deck and exploding inside. Yorktown, smaller and more maneuverable, twisted desperately under her captain's skillful ship handling, evading all but one bomb that hit near her island superstructure. The torpedo bombers came in next, skimming low over the water at less than 100 feet altitude, so close that their prop wash left wakes on the surface. The Type 91 aerial torpedo was one of Japan's most reliable weapons, unlike the American Mark 13, which often failed to detonate. Lexington's gunners fired everything they had, but the torpedo planes pressed their attacks with suicidal courage. Two torpedoes struck Lexington's port side, massive underwater explosions that lifted her 48,000-ton hull and sent shockwaves through every compartment. Yorktown took a single torpedo hit on her port side as well, the explosion killing or injuring dozens of men in the engineering spaces. But her damage control teams responded with practiced efficiency, immediately counterflooding to correct the list and shoring up damaged bulkheads. Within minutes, Yorktown's damage was under control. Lexington appeared to be in better shape, despite taking more hits. Her damage control officer reported that the ship was in no danger of sinking. Fires were under control. The list was being corrected by counterflooding. Both carriers began recovering their returning strike aircraft, flight operations continuing despite battle damage. As the last aircraft were brought aboard and the Japanese attackers disappeared over the horizon, Fletcher assessed the results. The tactical exchange seemed nearly even. Shokaku badly damaged but afloat. Both American carriers damaged but operational. Neither side had achieved a knockout blow. But the battle was far from over. The aftermath of the May 8th strikes revealed the chaotic reality of carrier warfare in 1942. Neither side had perfect information about the damage they'd inflicted or received. The Americans knew they'd hit Shokaku, but couldn't confirm how badly. She might be sinking or she might be operational. Fletcher didn't know that Zukaku had escaped completely undamaged. The Japanese knew they'd hit both American carriers but had no way to assess damage from the air. Pilots returning from strikes invariably overestimated the destruction they'd caused. A bomb hit might be reported as a ship sinking. A near miss might be reported as a hit. Both sides claimed victories they hadn't achieved and feared disasters that hadn't occurred. This was the fog of war at its thickest, commanders making life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information that was often hours out of date. By 1130 hours, both carrier forces were withdrawing. Takagi pulled his carriers north, knowing that Shokaku was badly damaged and needed to reach safety before American aircraft found her again. Fletcher maneuvered southeast, preparing to recover returning aircraft and assess damage. The first carrier versus carrier battle in history had been fought to a tactical draw. Both sides had bloodied each other. Neither had achieved a decisive victory. But the strategic situation had changed dramatically. The Port Moresby invasion convoy remained scattered and delayed. Operation Emo's primary objective unfulfilled. And hidden deep inside Lexington's hull, in spaces filled with volatile aviation fuel vapor, a disaster was quietly building that would transform this ambiguous tactical exchange into a crushing American defeat. The Battle of the Coral Sea wasn't over. The worst was yet to come. May 8, 1942, 1200 hours. Commander Healy, USS Lexington's damage control officer, stood in the ship's central damage control station, studying reports from repair parties throughout the massive carrier. The picture looked manageable. 2 bombs had penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar spaces, starting fires that were now under control. 2 torpedoes had struck the port side, killing dozens of men instantly and flooding several compartments, but the list was being corrected through counterflooding and damage was contained. Lexington's engines were running normally. She was making 25 knots, recovering aircraft, and appeared to be out of immediate danger. Healy allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. Lady Lex had taken a beating, but she would survive. She always did. What Healy couldn't see was the invisible killer accumulating in sealed compartments deep below the waterline. The torpedo hits had ruptured aviation fuel storage tanks and severed fuel lines. Thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline had spilled into bilges and void spaces where it couldn't drain properly. The volatile liquid evaporated rapidly in the tropical heat, creating pockets of explosive vapor that slowly spread through the ship's ventilation systems. 1942 carrier design included minimal vapor detection equipment. The accumulating fumes went unnoticed. Damage control parties worked to shore up bulkheads and stop flooding, unaware that they were walking through spaces that had become potential bombs. All it would take was a single spark. 12:47 hours. A motor generator in a sealed space near the forward elevator started automatically, its electric motor creating a small spark as the brushes made contact. The spark ignited accumulated gasoline vapor. The explosion wasn't massive, more like a large firecracker than a bomb, but it ruptured nearby fuel lines and started fires in spaces that were already saturated with fuel vapor. Secondary explosions followed within seconds as flames found more fuel. Men working in adjacent compartments died instantly, incinerated by blast waves or crushed by collapsing bulkheads. The concussion traveled through the ship's structure, shaking decks and throwing sailors off their feet. In Damage Control Central, Healy grabbed a phone and demanded reports. The news was grim. Internal explosions near the forward elevator, fires out of control, casualties mounting. Commander Healy rushed forward with repair parties, carrying hoses and firefighting equipment into smoke-filled passages that were becoming ovens. The heat was incredible, metal bulkheads too hot to touch, the air thick with smoke that burned the lungs and made breathing without masks impossible. They fought toward the fires, dragging hoses through corridors lit only by the red glow of flames. But the fires were spreading faster than they could be contained. Each new compartment that filled with gasoline vapor became another potential explosion. The ship's ventilation system, designed to keep the crew comfortable, was now distributing deadly fumes throughout the vessel. 1,445 hours brought the second major explosion, even larger than the first, as accumulated vapor in a major storage compartment detonated. The blast tore through 3 decks, killed dozens more men, and sent shockwaves through Lexington's hull that could be felt on every ship in the task force. Admiral Fitch, on Lexington's flag bridge, faced the commander's worst nightmare. His ship was dying beneath him, and there was nothing he could do to save her. Damage reports painted an impossible picture. Multiple fires burning out of control. Ammunition beginning to cook off as heat reached the magazines. Steering casualties, power failures. The engineering spaces were flooding, and the main engines were starting to falter. Worse, the internal explosions were continuing at random intervals as fire found new pockets of gasoline vapor. Each explosion killed more men and spread more fires. The ship's doctor set up triage stations in passageways, treating men with horrific burns, while explosions shook the deck beneath their feet. By 1,500 hours, Fitch knew the battle to save Lady Lex was lost. The question now was how to save her crew. Admiral Fletcher, watching from Yorktown, received Fitch's reports with growing horror. Lexington was mortally wounded, but the crew were still aboard. Thousands of men fighting fires or waiting for orders in spaces that were becoming death traps. Fletcher ordered destroyers alongside to take off wounded and non-essential personnel. The destroyers closed carefully, their skippers showing incredible seamanship to come alongside a ship that was exploding at random intervals. 1,630 hours brought Fletcher's hardest decision. He gave Admiral Fitch permission to abandon ship. The order went out, all hands abandon Lexington. 2,770 men would have to leave their ship, and many of them would have to jump into oil-covered water from a deck that was 60 feet above the surface. The evacuation was remarkably orderly, considering the circumstances. Officers and chiefs moved through the ship, ensuring that wounded men were brought topside first. Sailors helped each other over the side, forming human chains to pass injured men down to small boats, or directly to destroyer decks. Many jumped directly into the water, swimming away from the burning hull before being picked up by destroyers or whaleboats. There was no panic. These were professional sailors who'd trained for this moment, though they'd prayed it would never come. The evacuation continued throughout the afternoon as internal explosions grew more frequent and violent. Ammunition was cooking off now, shells detonating inside the magazines, sending shockwaves through what remained of the ship's structure. By 1700 hours, Admiral Fitch was among the last to leave, stepping off Lady Lex's deck onto a destroyer with the bitter knowledge that he was abandoning his flagship. Fletcher faced one final grim task. Lexington could not be left afloat as a drifting hulk that might be salvaged by the Japanese or become a navigation hazard. She had to be sunk. Destroyer USS Phelps was given the somber duty. At 1707 hours, Phelps fired 5 torpedoes into Lexington's starboard side from close range. The torpedoes ran true, punching massive holes below the waterline. Combined with the damage from Japanese torpedoes and internal explosions, this was too much even for Lexington's rugged construction. She began settling by the stern, her flight deck awash, fire still burning fiercely. Sailors on surrounding destroyers watched in silence as their shipmates' home began her final dive. 1952 hours. USS Lexington capsized to port and slid beneath the waves, taking with her the 216 men who died fighting her fires and the millions of dollars of irreplaceable pre-war construction that represented. She took 36 aircraft that had been aboard when she sank. She took tons of aviation fuel, hundreds of bombs and torpedoes, spare parts, tools, and all the accumulated equipment of a fleet carrier. Most painfully, she took the memories of nearly 3,000 men who'd called her home. Survivors watched from destroyer decks as the water closed over Lady Lex. Some wept openly. Others stood in numb silence. They'd done everything humanly possible to save their ship, fought fires for more than 5 hours with incredible courage, and still she died. The loss wasn't caused by Japanese bombs or torpedoes. Those had been survived. The loss was caused by a design flaw that nobody had fully appreciated. Aviation fuel vapor was as deadly as any weapon the enemy could deploy. The strategic implications of Lexington's loss would take days to fully understand, but the immediate tactical impact was clear. Task Force 17 had entered the Coral Sea with 2 fleet carriers and was leaving with 1 damaged carrier. Yorktown had taken a bomb hit and a torpedo hit but remained operational, her damage control teams having demonstrated exactly the kind of effective response that might have saved Lexington if her internal explosions could have been prevented. Fletcher withdrew southeast toward New Caledonia, his task force reduced by 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 1 oiler, and over 1,000 men killed or wounded. The Japanese withdrew north. Their invasion convoy recalled, Shokaku limping toward Japan for repairs that would take months. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides had paid in blood, but only one side had lost a fleet carrier to her own gasoline. May 9, 1940, 2:08 hours. Admiral Chester Nimitz sat in his office at Pearl Harbor reading after-action reports from the Coral Sea with a mixture of relief and dismay. Task Force 17 had stopped the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby, achieving the primary strategic objective. But the cost had been severe. Lexington sunk, Yorktown damaged, destroyer Sims and oiler Neosho lost. Over 650 men killed. Against this, the Japanese had lost light carrier Shoho and suffered damage to Shokaku. On paper, the exchange looked like a Japanese victory. They'd sunk more tonnage and inflicted more casualties. But Nimitz understood something that would take the Japanese longer to grasp. The battle's outcome wasn't measured in ships sunk, but in objectives achieved. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. Australia was secure. Operation Mo had failed. That made it an American strategic victory regardless of the tactical accounting. In Tokyo, Imperial General Headquarters conducted its own assessment with characteristic Japanese attention to detail. Staff officers tallied the results. 1 American fleet carrier confirmed sunk. 1 American fleet carrier probably damaged. Various cruisers and destroyers sunk or damaged based on pilot reports. Against this, Japan had lost 1 light carrier and suffered damage to 1 fleet carrier. The numbers supported declaring a victory. Newspapers announced another Japanese triumph. The public, accustomed to an unbroken string of victories since Pearl Harbor, accepted the announcement without question. But among the naval staff, doubts lingered. Why had the Port Moresby invasion been postponed? Why had Admiral Inoue, commanding Operation MO, decided not to proceed without carrier air cover? If the Americans were so badly hurt, why were Japanese ships withdrawing instead of pressing the advantage? The human cost was starkest for those who'd actually fought the battle. Aboard destroyers returning from the Coral Sea, Lexington survivors tried to process what they'd experienced. Many had lost everything: personal possessions, photographs from home, the small comforts that made life bearable during war. Some had lost close friends, men they'd served with for years, gone in an instant when a bomb or explosion found the wrong compartment. The survivors faced the peculiar guilt of men who'd lived when others died, wondering why they'd been topside when the explosions came while their shipmates were below decks with no chance of escape. The Navy would redistribute these men to other ships, incorporating their experience into new crews, but the psychological scars would last much longer than the physical wounds. Japanese pilots and sailors faced their own reckoning. They'd fought bravely and skillfully as everyone expected. But for the first time since the war began, they'd achieved an ambiguous result instead of overwhelming victory. American carriers had proven to be dangerous opponents, not the pushover targets of earlier battles. Shokaku's damage demonstrated that even modern carriers were vulnerable to concentrated air attack. Worst of all, Operation Mo's postponement meant the strategic objective hadn't been achieved. Japanese expansion had been stopped, at least temporarily, by an American force that was supposed to be demoralized and defeated. Some of the more perceptive officers began wondering if they'd underestimated their opponent. The Battle of the Coral Sea's most important consequence wouldn't be fully understood for another month. Shokaku entered dry dock at Kure Naval Arsenal on May 22nd for repairs that would take until mid-July. Zukaku had escaped physical damage, but her air group had been decimated, many experienced pilots killed, many aircraft destroyed. Reconstituting and training a new air group would take at least 8 weeks. This meant that when Admiral Yamamoto launched Operation MI against Midway in early June, he would do so without 2 of Japan's best carriers. The Japanese would enter the Battle of Midway with 4 carriers instead of 6. The Americans, rushing to repair Yorktown in an emergency 48-hour overhaul, would field 3 carriers instead of the 2 that would have been available if Coral Sea hadn't bought time for repairs. The carrier arithmetic of Midway, 4 Japanese carriers versus 3 American, was determined by Coral Sea's aftermath. The final accounting revealed patterns that naval analysts would study for decades. Japan had lost 77 aircraft at Coral Sea, including many veteran pilots who were extremely difficult to replace. America had lost 69 aircraft, including many pilots, but the American training pipeline could replace losses much faster than Japan's elite-focused system. Japan had lost 1,074 men killed, America 656. Both sides had demonstrated that carrier warfare was brutally attritional. Ships could be protected by escorts and anti-aircraft fire, but determined attackers would always get through, and losses would be heavy on both sides. The side that could absorb losses and rebuild would ultimately prevail. Japan's industry could build perhaps 150 aircraft per month. America's industry was already producing 2,000 per month, and accelerating. This was the strategic equation that trumped tactical outcomes. Admiral Fletcher's performance at Coral Sea became controversial almost immediately and would remain debated by historians for decades. His critics argued that he'd been too cautious, withdrawing too quickly after Lexington was sunk instead of pursuing the damaged Japanese carriers. His defenders pointed out that he'd achieved the strategic objective, stopping the Port Moresby invasion, while preserving Yorktown for future operations. Fletcher's caution at Coral Sea would influence Nimitz's command decisions later. When Fletcher commanded at Guadalcanal, his tendency to withdraw carriers from contested waters would create tension with other commanders, who wanted more aggressive action. But at Coral Sea, his caution had been vindicated. He'd stopped Operation MO without losing both carriers, leaving the Pacific Fleet with enough strength to contest Midway. The most overlooked aspect of Coral Sea's outcome was the impact on Australian morale and strategic planning. Prime Minister John Curtin had been demanding greater Allied resources for Australian defense, arguing that the continent faced potential invasion. The Battle of the Coral Sea demonstrated that America would commit its scarce carriers to defending Australia's approaches. Port Moresby's retention meant that northeastern Australia remained beyond Japanese bomber range. The immediate invasion threat, such as it was, had been eliminated. Australia could now serve as a secure base for future Allied operations, eventually hosting hundreds of thousands of American troops as the staging ground for the long counteroffensive toward Japan. This strategic victory was purchased with Lexington's loss and 600 American lives, but it fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory. By mid-May, both sides were preparing for their next operations, incorporating Coral Sea's lessons into new plans. The Japanese accelerated preparations for Operation MI against Midway, confident that eliminating the remaining American carriers would force a negotiated peace. The Americans, with Yorktown being frantically repaired at Pearl Harbor, prepared to defend Midway based on intelligence that Station Hippo was even now decrypting. Coral Sea had been the warm-up act. The main event would come in early June, when the same intelligence apparatus, similar carrier forces, and many of the same pilots would meet again in waters north of Hawaii. But the Battle of the Coral Sea had changed the equation. Japan would go to Midway without Shokaku and Zuika. America would go with hard-won experience of carrier warfare and renewed confidence that the Imperial Japanese Navy could be fought to a draw, and perhaps beaten. The final toll from the Battle of the Coral Sea extended far beyond ships and aircraft. Both navies had learned that carrier warfare was fundamentally different from traditional naval combat. Finding the enemy mattered as much as fighting them. Intelligence determined initial positioning. Weather could hide or expose entire task forces. Identification errors could waste entire strikes on wrong targets. Damage control could save ships that appeared doomed, or fail to save ships that seemed survivable. These lessons would shape every carrier battle for the rest of the war. The Battle of the Coral Sea had been the laboratory where these principles were tested with real ships and real lives. The graduates of that laboratory would fight better battles and make fewer mistakes, but they would never forget the price of their education, paid in burning ships and drowning men in a remote stretch of ocean that most Americans couldn't find on a map. May 1942, Naval Air Station North Island, California. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thack sat in a classroom with a dozen fighter pilots, drawing diagrams on a blackboard. His hands moved quickly, sketching aircraft positions and attack angles, explaining the tactic that had crystallized in his mind during the desperate fighter combat over the Coral Sea. The standard fighter tactics weren't working against Japanese Zeros, he explained. American Grumman F-4F Wildcats were slower and less maneuverable than Zeros. Trying to dogfight them one-on-one was suicide. But Wildcats were rugged and well-armed with .650 caliber machine guns. They could take punishment that would destroy a Zero. The solution wasn't to outturn the Japanese fighters, but to create mutual support between pairs of Wildcats. Thack drew the weaving pattern that would become legendary. Two fighters flying parallel courses, each protecting the other's tail by turning into any Zero that tried to attack. The Thatch weave would save hundreds of American pilots' lives, and it emerged directly from Coral Sea's bloody lessons. The tactical failures at Coral Sea had been numerous and painful. American torpedo squadrons had achieved almost nothing despite losing multiple aircraft. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo remained wretchedly unreliable, with approximately 20% of torpedoes either failing to run properly, running too deep, or failing to detonate when they hit targets. Torpedo bombers approached their targets at slow speed and low altitude, making them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and fighters. Yet they rarely achieved hits that justified the risk. This was a catastrophic equipment failure that the Navy had known about since peacetime exercises but had failed to fix. Combat reports from Coral Sea added more evidence to a growing pile of documentation about torpedo problems. Still, the Bureau of Ordnance resisted making major changes. The torpedo problems wouldn't be fully resolved until late 1940, meaning American torpedo bomber crews fought with defective weapons for more than 2 years. Fighter direction and radar integration had proven equally problematic during the Coral Sea battle. Both American carriers had radar sets capable of detecting incoming aircraft at ranges up to 100 miles under ideal conditions. but translating radar contacts into effective fighter interceptions remained a black art in 1942. Combat information centers were primitive, usually just a few officers and enlisted men trying to plot aircraft positions on paper charts, while radio communications crackled with urgent reports from multiple sources simultaneously. Fighters had to be directed by radio to specific intercept points, but the radios were short-ranged and unreliable. Communications were often garbled, and the three-dimensional geometry of high-speed interceptions defeated many attempts at coordination. Japanese attackers often penetrated to the carriers before fighters could intercept them, not because there weren't enough fighters, but because the fighters couldn't be vectored to the right positions in time. In Japan, naval analysts conducted their own after-action review with characteristic thoroughness. The results were sobering. Japanese carriers had lost 77 aircraft at Coral Sea, a stunning number that exceeded losses from Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, and the East Indies combined. Many of these losses came from American anti-aircraft fire, which had proven more effective than expected. The Americans had concentrated their task force, bringing multiple ships' anti-aircraft batteries to bear on attackers simultaneously. Japanese doctrine emphasized dispersed formations to reduce vulnerability to torpedo attack, but this spread defensive firepower too thin. The answer seemed obvious: concentrate carriers and escorts for mutual anti-aircraft protection. But this concentration made the formation a larger target for submarines. There was no perfect solution. The Japanese also noticed a troubling pattern in aircrew losses. Junior pilots were being killed at high rates, while experienced leaders survived by virtue of superior skill and assigned positions in formations that kept them away from the heaviest fire. This seemed acceptable in the short term, preserved the best pilots to train new ones, but it created a vulnerability that nobody fully appreciated yet. Each battle stripped away the layer of pilots with moderate experience, leaving a growing gap between elite veterans and barely trained newcomers. Japanese pilot training took 3 to 5 years to produce carrier-qualified aviators, and the training pipeline couldn't be expanded quickly due to limited facilities and instructors. America's training pipeline, though producing less skilled pilots initially, had vastly greater capacity and could be expanded rapidly. This asymmetry would prove decisive, but in May 1942 it wasn't yet obvious. Damage control emerged as perhaps the most important lesson from Coral Sea. Lexington had been lost, not to enemy action, but to internal explosions caused by aviation fuel vapor accumulation. American naval architects immediately began reviewing carrier designs to prevent similar disasters. The Essex-class carriers, already under construction, received design modifications based directly on Lexington's loss. Better ventilation systems would prevent vapor accumulation. Improved fuel line protection would reduce ruptures from combat damage. Enhanced compartmentalization would contain flooding more effectively. Fire suppression systems would be upgraded throughout the ships. These modifications, implemented across America's carrier construction program, would save many ships and thousands of lives in battles to come. But they came too late for Lady Lex. Japanese damage control philosophy differed fundamentally from American approaches. Japanese designers emphasized preventing damage through armor and structural protection, believing that if a ship was properly designed, it shouldn't need large damage control parties. American designers, working within treaty tonnage limits that made comprehensive armor impossible, emphasized trained damage control teams that could respond flexibly to whatever damage occurred. Coral Sea validated the American approach. Yorktown survived a bomb hit and torpedo hit through excellent damage control work. Shokaku survived multiple bomb hits because her damage control teams controlled fires and flooding effectively. But Lexington, despite initially surviving her battle damage, was killed by an internal threat that damage control teams couldn't reach in time. The lesson seemed clear. Ships needed both good design and excellent damage control. Neither alone was sufficient. Communication and coordination failures plagued both sides throughout the battle. Strike aircraft launched without sufficient intelligence about target locations. Scout planes failed to maintain contact with enemy forces they'd located, leaving follow-on strikes to search blindly. Radio discipline collapsed during attacks as pilots transmitted excited reports that jammed frequencies and prevented critical messages from getting through. Navigation errors, scattered formations, and delayed attacks. The TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were so slow that faster dive bombers couldn't coordinate attacks with them without circling and wasting fuel. These problems weren't unique to Coral Sea. They were endemic to carrier warfare in 1942. But Coral Sea made them painfully obvious. Both navies began developing improved procedures, better radios, and stricter communication protocols. But implementation would take months, while pilots were still flying missions with the same flawed systems. The strategic implications of Coral Sea's lessons extended beyond tactics and equipment. Both sides realized that carrier battles were extremely attritional. Locating the enemy first provided an advantage, but even the side that struck first would likely suffer heavy damage if the enemy got their strike launched. There would be no perfect victories, no Pearl Harbors where one side devastated the other without suffering casualties. Every carrier battle would be a mutual bloodletting where both sides lost valuable aircraft, pilots, and ships. For Japan, with limited industrial capacity and a small pilot training pipeline, this attrition was unsustainable. For America, with massive industrial capacity and expanding training infrastructure, attrition warfare played to their strengths. Japanese strategists understood this intellectually, but couldn't escape the doctrine of decisive battle that had dominated their thinking since Admiral Togo destroyed the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905. They kept seeking the knockout blow that would force America to negotiate, not understanding that America's strategy was to absorb punishment, rebuild, and overwhelm Japan through sheer numbers. By June 1942, as both sides prepared for the next carrier battle at Midway, the lessons of Coral Sea were beginning to be implemented. American fighters would use the thatch weave. Damage control procedures had been reviewed and improved. Combat information centers were being reorganized for better coordination. But many problems remained unsolved. The Mark 13 torpedo was still defective. Fighter direction was still primitive. Communication systems were still inadequate. Carrier warfare remained a deadly gamble where luck and weather could matter as much as skill and planning. The Battle of the Coral Sea had been an education, but graduation was still years away. The war would be fought with imperfect tools, flawed doctrine, and incomplete knowledge. The side that learned faster and adapted better would ultimately prevail. In May 1942, it wasn't yet clear which side that would be. May 18, 1942, Hashirajima Anchorage, Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of battleship Yamato, flagship of the combined fleet, reviewing plans for Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Island. Yamamoto had designed this operation to force the decisive battle that would cripple America's Pacific Fleet and bring the war to a favorable conclusion. 6 fleet carriers would launch overwhelming strikes against Midway's defenses, then destroy the American carriers that would inevitably respond. It was an elegant plan, meticulously detailed, supported by dozens of ships including Yamato herself, the largest battleship ever built. But as staff officers briefed the latest modifications, Yamamoto learned that the carrier arithmetic had changed. Shokaku remained in dry dock at Kure, her Coral Sea damage requiring 2 more months of repairs. Zukaku was available, but her air group had been decimated. Too many experienced pilots killed, too many aircraft destroyed. Reconstituting and training replacements would take 8 weeks minimum. Operation MI would proceed with 4 fleet carriers instead of 6. Yamamoto approved the modification without visible reaction, but inside he felt a cold unease. 4 carriers would have to be enough. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz faced different mathematics. Yorktown had limped back to Hawaii with bomb and torpedo damage that would normally require 3 months of shipyard work. But Station Hypo's cryptanalysts had given him priceless intelligence. The Japanese were planning a major operation against Midway in early June, and it would involve most of Japan's remaining carriers. This was the opportunity Nimitz had hoped for, a chance to ambush the Japanese with advanced knowledge of their plans. But he needed carriers. Enterprise and Hornet were available. Yorktown was damaged. If the shipyard couldn't repair her in time, he'd face 4 Japanese carriers with only 2 American carriers. Nimitz visited the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard and spoke directly with the repair crews. How fast could they work? The yard superintendent examined the damage list and promised the impossible: 48 hours. Yorktown entered dry dock on May 27th. Hundreds of workers swarmed over her around the clock, welding patches, replacing damaged equipment, ignoring normal procedures in a race against time. The Battle of Coral Sea cast its shadow over Midway in ways both obvious and subtle. American pilots who'd fought over the Coral Sea now briefed their squadrons on what to expect from Japanese carriers and Zero fighters. They described the desperate fighter combat, the deadly accuracy of Japanese dive bombers, the terrifying experience of attacking through intense anti-aircraft fire. New pilots listened with wide eyes, trying to imagine what their veteran leaders described. The veterans also described American successes: the coordinated dive bomber attack that sank Shoho in 30 minutes, the effective anti-aircraft defense that shot down many Japanese attackers, the damage control work that saved Yorktown despite taking hits. These lessons would prove invaluable in early June, when the same veterans flew against the same Japanese carriers they'd fought 6 weeks earlier. Lieutenant Commander John Thack took his fighter pilots through intensive training in the TAC, weave tactic he'd developed after Coral Sea. The pilots practiced the mutual support turns until they could execute them instinctively, without thinking. On June 3rd, Yorktown's Fighter Squadron VF-3 would deploy to Midway with this new tactic ready for combat. The Japanese had no knowledge of this tactical development. Their intelligence, which had failed to warn them about the American carriers at Coral Sea, remained inadequate. Japanese planning for Midway assumed American forces would react after the island was attacked, not that American carriers might already be waiting in ambush position. This intelligence failure, mirroring the intelligence advantage that Station Hippo had given Nimitz, would prove catastrophic. The carrier forces that would fight at Midway were shaped directly by Coral Sea's outcome. Admiral Fletcher, who'd commanded at Coral Sea, would again command the American force, flying his flag from Yorktown despite her hasty repairs. Many of his staff officers had fought at Coral Sea. They knew what Japanese carriers could do, and they knew American carriers could survive their attacks if damage control was effective. This confidence, purchased with Lexington's loss and hundreds of lives, manifested in Fletcher's decisions at Midway. He wouldn't be paralyzed by caution or overawed by Japanese reputation. He'd fight aggressively because Coral Sea had taught him that aggressive action, combined with good intelligence, could defeat seemingly superior forces. The Japanese approached Midway with less awareness of what they'd learned and failed to learn at Coral Sea. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force, had not participated in Operation Mo. His carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, were the Pearl Harbor veterans, confident in their superiority. They'd heard about Coral Sea, but considered it an aberration, perhaps bad luck or poor execution by the commanders involved. Shokaku's damage didn't suggest fundamental flaws in carrier doctrine, merely the unfortunate result of an attack that got through defenses. The loss of Shoho was regrettable but acceptable. Light carriers were expendable assets. The larger lesson that American carriers represented dangerous opponents who could inflict crippling damage even while being destroyed themselves hadn't penetrated Japanese thinking at the operational level. This complacency would cost them dearly. June 4th, 1942, 0400 hours. Nagumo's carriers launched their initial strike against Midway Island, unaware that 3 American carriers were positioned northwest of the island waiting to strike. The American carriers had reached their ambush position undetected, thanks to intelligence from Station Hippo. The same cryptanalysts who detected Operation MO now delivered even more precise warning about Operation MI. At 0700 hours, American scout planes located the Japanese carriers. Fletcher ordered immediate launch of every available aircraft. The same sequence that had played out at Coral Sea was repeating at Midway, but with crucial differences. This time the Americans had 3 carriers versus Japan's 4. This time the Americans knew exactly where the enemy was before the battle began. This time the Americans had learned from Coral Sea's mistakes. The Battle of Midway played out over the course of one chaotic day. But Coral Sea's influence appeared in dozens of small moments that collectively determined the outcome. when American torpedo bombers attacked Japanese carriers and were slaughtered by Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. They demonstrated the same suicidal courage that had characterized torpedo attacks at Coral Sea, and the same tragic ineffectiveness due to the defective Mark 13 torpedoes. When American dive bombers finally hit 3 Japanese carriers simultaneously at 10:25, destroying them in minutes, they executed the same kind of coordinated attack that had sunk Shoho. When Yorktown took bomb and torpedo hits, but initially remained operational, her damage control teams applied lessons learned from both Yorktown's survival and Lexington's loss at Coral Sea. When Japanese aircraft from carrier Hiryu attacked Yorktown, they employed the same tactics that had worked at Coral Sea. And Yorktown's gunners, many of whom had fought at Coral Sea, shot down many attackers before they reached release points. The most direct connection between Coral Sea and Midway came in the carrier arithmetic. If Shokaku and Zuikaku had been available, Japan would have fielded 6 fleet carriers at Midway versus America's 3. The additional carrier strength might have overwhelmed American defenses through sheer numbers. But Coral Sea had eliminated those 2 carriers from the battle, one through battle damage requiring extended repairs, one through air group losses requiring extended training. The 4 versus 3 carrier balance at Midway, which still favored Japan numerically, proved insufficient when American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers with their decks loaded with armed and fueled aircraft. All 3 carriers were destroyed within minutes. Hiryu launched a retaliatory strike that crippled Yorktown, but she was then located and destroyed by American dive bombers. By evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk. America had lost Yorktown, though she would not actually sink until June 7th. The Battle of Midway was a decisive American victory, and it had been made possible by Coral Sea's strategic outcome. The irony of Yorktown's fate would not be lost on historians. The carrier had been damaged at Coral Sea, frantically repaired, rushed to Midway, fought brilliantly, took lethal damage, and finally sank on June 7th, the same ship and many of the same crew members who'd fought at Coral Sea. Yorktown had given her life twice for her country, first by absorbing damage at Coral Sea that might have gone to Lexington, then by fighting at Midway when she should have been in dry dock. Her loss was tragic, but strategically acceptable. Yorktown had helped win 2 battles before going down, buying time and inflicting damage that tipped the Pacific War's balance toward America. The lesson was clear. Carrier warfare demanded sacrifice. Ships would be lost. Men would die. But if those losses achieved strategic objectives, if they purchased time for American industry to build replacement carriers and train replacement pilots, then the sacrifices had meaning. That cold calculus, first tested at Coral Sea, would govern American strategy for the rest of the war. June 1942. Bureau of Ships, Washington, D.C. naval architects and engineers crowded around a conference table covered with blueprints and damage reports from USS Lexington. The photographs were devastating: twisted metal, burned compartments, ruptured fuel lines. But these weren't being studied with grief. They were being studied with cold analytical precision to ensure that no American carrier would die the same way again. Commander Edward Cochran, chief of the preliminary design section, traced his finger along a fuel line schematic. The problem wasn't the torpedo hits, he explained to the assembled engineers. It was the vapor accumulation in sealed spaces. We need better ventilation, better fuel line protection, and most critically, we need vapor detection systems. The Essex-class carriers under construction would incorporate every lesson from Lexington's death. The ships being built in shipyards from Brooklyn to California would be different. Safer, more survivable, harder to kill. Lady Lex's sacrifice would save thousands of lives. The transformation of American carrier doctrine accelerated throughout 1942 as Coral Sea's lessons propagated through the fleet. Combat information centers evolved from primitive plotting rooms into sophisticated nerve centers, where radar operators, radio operators, fighter directors, and senior officers worked in coordinated teams. New procedures emphasized early detection and vectored interception. Use radar to find incoming raids as far out as possible, then direct fighters to intercept before attackers reached the task force. USS Enterprise pioneered many of these improvements, incorporating feedback from officers who'd served aboard Lexington and Yorktown. By late 1940, two American carriers were developing the integrated air defense system that would make them formidable defensive platforms. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained focused on offensive action, believing that the best defense was to strike first and strike hard. This doctrinal divergence would become increasingly important as the war progressed. Fighter tactics underwent systematic revision based on Coral Sea combat reports. The TAC weave became standard doctrine for all carrier fighter squadrons, thoroughly documented in tactical publications distributed fleet-wide. But Thatch himself continued refining the concept, developing variations for different combat situations. His work at Naval Air Station North Island produced a generation of fighter pilots who understood that success came from mutual support and disciplined tactics, not individual heroics. The Americans were learning to fight as teams, while Japanese fighter pilots, despite their superior aircraft and initial skill advantage, remained wedded to individual combat that emphasized personal glory. This cultural difference in combat philosophy would manifest in casualty rates. American pilots survived longer, gained experience faster, and could pass that experience to new pilots through formalized training programs. The industrial dimension of carrier warfare became impossible to ignore after Coral Sea and Midway. America had lost Lexington and Yorktown. Japan had lost Shokaku, temporarily, and all four Midway carriers. But the replacement timelines were starkly different. American shipyards had 17 Essex-class fleet carriers under construction by mid-1942, with the first scheduled for completion in December. Japanese shipyards had 0 fleet carriers under construction. Their pre-war building program had emphasized battleships over carriers, a strategic error that would prove catastrophic. Japan could convert existing hulls into light carriers, but these expedients couldn't replace the combat power of fleet carriers like the ones being lost in battle. By 1943, America would achieve overwhelming carrier superiority simply through industrial production. Coral Sea had demonstrated that carrier warfare was attritional. American industry would win that attrition battle decisively. Pilot training underwent even more dramatic transformation than ship design or tactics. The United States Navy expanded its training infrastructure massively throughout 1942, building new air stations, recruiting instructors, and developing standardized curricula. The goal was to produce 3,000 new naval aviators per month by mid-1943. These pilots wouldn't be as skilled as pre-war aviators who trained for years, but they didn't need to be. American doctrine emphasized adequate training combined with superior numbers, better aircraft, and team tactics that compensated for individual skill limitations. A moderately skilled pilot in a Wildcat using the Thatch weave could defeat a highly skilled Japanese pilot in a Zero who fought alone. And if that American pilot was shot down, there were dozens of replacements in the training pipeline. Japan's training infrastructure, by contrast, remained limited by pre-war facilities, instructor availability, and a cultural emphasis on elite quality over quantity. Japanese monthly pilot production never exceeded 1,000 per month and declined as the war progressed, and experienced instructors died in combat. The technical evolution of carrier aircraft accelerated as combat experience revealed deficiencies in existing designs. American aircraft designers received detailed reports from Coral Sea describing exactly what worked and what failed. The TBD Devastator torpedo bomber had proven to be a death trap, slow, poorly armed, vulnerable to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Its replacement, the TBM Avenger, was already in production with better speed, armament, and survivability. The F-4F Wildcat fighter had proven rugged and reliable, but was outclassed by the Zero in speed and maneuverability. Its replacement, the F-6F Hellcat, was being designed specifically to defeat Zeros using lessons from Coral Sea and Midway. The Hellcat would be faster, better armed, and retain the Wildcat's legendary ruggedness. Japanese aircraft development, by contrast, remained focused on incremental improvements to existing designs rather than revolutionary new aircraft. The Zero would remain Japan's primary carrier fighter throughout the war, its initial advantages gradually eroded by better American tactics and newer American aircraft. Damage control doctrine became a major focus of fleet-wide training after Lexington's loss. Every carrier crew received intensive instruction in firefighting, flooding control, and vapor hazard management. Damage control parties trained constantly, running drills that simulated battle damage and required immediate response. The Navy established damage control schools that taught officers and enlisted men the science of ship stability, the chemistry of fire suppression, the engineering principles of compartmentalization. This wasn't glamorous training. It involved crawling through hot, dark, smoke-filled compartments while simulated fires raged and water flooded the space. But it saved ships. When carriers took damage in future battles, their damage control parties would respond with practiced efficiency that often meant the difference between survival and loss. The Japanese never developed equivalent training infrastructure, relying instead on small damage control teams and design features that emphasized preventing damage rather than controlling it after it occurred. The strategic employment of carriers evolved throughout 1942 as American commanders gained confidence from Coral Sea and Midway successes. The defensive mentality that had characterized the immediate post-Pearl Harbor period gave way to increasing aggressiveness. Carriers began supporting amphibious landings, providing air cover for invasion forces that allowed the Marines to establish footholds on Japanese-held islands. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning in August 1942, would see carriers employed in this role repeatedly despite heavy risks. This represented a fundamental shift in carrier doctrine, from preserving scarce assets at all costs to accepting losses as necessary to achieve strategic objectives. Coral Sea had demonstrated that carriers could be traded for strategic gains. Midway had demonstrated that aggressive carrier action could win decisive victories. The lesson seemed clear. Use the carriers boldly, replace losses through industrial production, and maintain offensive pressure that prevented Japanese recovery. By 1943, the transformation was complete. American carriers entering service were fundamentally different vessels from Lexington and Yorktown. The Essex-class carriers displaced 36,000 tons fully loaded, carried 100 aircraft, had dramatically improved damage control systems, featured sophisticated radar and communication equipment, and incorporated every lesson purchased with blood at Coral Sea. Their air groups flew new aircraft, Hellcat fighters, Avenger torpedo bombers, Helldiver dive bombers, all designed with combat experience informing their specifications. Their crews had trained with Coral Sea veterans who taught them what to expect and how to survive. The American carrier force of 1943 bore little resemblance to the force that had fought desperately in the Coral Sea 18 months earlier. It was larger, more capable, better equipped, better trained, and led by officers who'd learned their trade in the hardest possible school. The Japanese carrier force of 1943, by contrast, was weaker than it had been in May 1942. Shokaku and Zuikaku remained the most capable fleet carriers, but they were supported only by converted light carriers with limited aircraft capacity. Experienced pilots had been killed in successive battles faster than the training pipeline could replace them. Aircraft designs remained largely unchanged from 1942, their initial advantages now neutralized by American tactical and technical improvements. Japanese carrier doctrine remained focused on the decisive battle concept that had failed at Midway, unable or unwilling to adapt to the attritional reality that Coral Sea had revealed. When the two carrier forces met again at Philippine Sea in June 1944, the gap in capability would be so vast that the result would be nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft slaughtered by the hundreds while achieving almost nothing. That devastating defeat had its roots in May 1942, in the Coral Sea, where both navies first learned that carrier warfare demanded continuous evolution, and only one navy proved capable of learning fast enough. December 1945, Tokyo Bay. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher stood on the deck of USS Missouri, watching Japanese officials sign the surrender documents that formally ended the Second World War. Fletcher had commanded American forces at both Coral Sea and Midway, the two battles that had blunted Japan's offensive momentum and begun the long counteroffensive toward this moment. But his career after those battles had been complicated. marked by controversy and criticism that would shadow him for the rest of his life. At Guadalcanal, his decision to withdraw carriers from the invasion area after only 2 days had sparked furious criticism from Marines left without air cover. His caution, which had seemed vindicated at Coral Sea when it preserved Yorktown for Midway, now seemed excessive to commanders who wanted aggressive action. Fletcher had been quietly reassigned to shore duty in late 1942. His career as a carrier commander effectively over. Standing on Missouri's deck, watching Japan surrender, Fletcher wondered if history would judge him fairly. He'd stopped Operation Mo. He'd won at Midway. What more could have been asked? Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thack's story followed a different trajectory. His fighter tactics, developed from Coral Sea experience and proven at Midway, had made him one of the Navy's most influential aviators. By 1943, he was commanding air groups and training new fighter pilots in tactics that were saving American lives throughout the Pacific. His personal combat record was impressive. 7 confirmed kills, numerous probable kills, and most importantly, 0 wingmen lost to enemy fighters when flying under his tactical command. After the war, Thatch would continue serving, eventually retiring as a 4-star admiral in 1973. His legacy wasn't measured in ships sunk or battles won, but in the thousands of pilots who survived combat because they'd learned his tactics. The tack weave remained standard fighter doctrine for decades, adapted to jet aircraft and still taught to naval aviators in modified form, into the 21st century. Thatch's contribution to winning the Pacific War was as significant as any admiral's strategic decisions, though far less visible. The Japanese commanders who'd fought at Coral Sea faced grimmer fates. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, who'd commanded the MO striking force, continued serving in various fleet commands through 1943. He was killed in July 1944 when his staff car was strafed by American aircraft in the Philippines. Admiral Inoue, who'd commanded Operation MO from Rabaul and made the controversial decision to postpone the Port Moresby invasion after Shoho was sunk, was relieved of command and given administrative positions for the rest of the war. His caution in withdrawing the invasion force, which had actually been the correct decision given the loss of air cover, was seen by more aggressive officers as defeatism. The Imperial Japanese Navy had little tolerance for commanders who failed to achieve objectives, regardless of circumstances. Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, who'd led the strike against Lexington and Yorktown, continued flying combat missions until October 1942, when he was killed during the Battle of Santa Cruz. He'd survived Coral Sea and Midway only to die in another carrier battle 6 months later, part of the steady attrition of Japanese naval aviation's most experienced officers. The fate of the ships that fought at Coral Sea illustrated the brutal arithmetic of carrier warfare. USS Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, repaired in 48 hours, fought at Midway, and sank on June 7, 1942. Her crew was distributed to other ships, carrying with them the experience of 2 major battles fought within a month. USS Lexington rested on the bottom of the Coral Sea at a depth of 3,000 meters, her hull relatively intact despite the explosions that killed her. The wreck wouldn't be discovered until March 2018 when Paul Allen's research vessel Petrel located her using advanced sonar. Photographs showed Lady Lex sitting upright on the seabed, her flight deck visible, her hull remarkably preserved by the cold, deep water. For the survivors who'd watched her sink 76 years earlier, the discovery brought closure and renewed grief. Their ship, their home, was still there in the darkness. The Japanese carriers told similar stories of loss and survival. Shoho, sunk at Coral Sea on May 7, 1942, was the first Japanese carrier lost in the war. Her wreck has never been found, though she's believed to rest somewhere in the Coral Sea at similar depths to Lexington. Shokaku, damaged at Coral Sea, repaired and returned to service, fought through the Solomons campaign before being sunk by submarine USS Kavala in June 1944 during the Battle of Philippine Sea. She went down with 1,200 men, her loss marking the end of one of Japan's finest carriers. Zuki Kaku, which had escaped Coral Sea undamaged by hiding in weather fronts, survived until October 1944, when American carrier aircraft sank her during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. She was the last surviving carrier from Pearl Harbor, her sinking symbolizing the complete destruction of Japanese naval aviation. Both ships had been present at almost every major carrier battle of the Pacific War, from Pearl Harbor through their final losses. They'd been magnificent ships, staffed by brave men, but they'd fought for a cause that industrial mathematics doomed from the beginning. The human cost of Coral Sea extended far beyond the battle itself. The 656 Americans, killed on May 7th and 8th, 1942, left behind widows, orphans, parents who would never recover from their losses. Many died instantly when bombs or torpedoes struck, never knowing what hit them. Others died slowly, trapped in flooded compartments or burning spaces, fully aware they were going to die. Still others died in the water after abandoning ship, succumbing to injuries or exposure or sharks in the hours before rescue. The 216 men who died aboard Lexington were particularly tragic. They'd survived the Japanese attack, only to be killed by their own ship's gasoline vapors. Some were never found, vaporized in explosions, or trapped in compartments that flooded before they could escape. Their names are listed on memorials, but their bodies were never recovered, lost forever in the depths of the Coral Sea. The Japanese losses, 1,074 men killed, represented a higher absolute number, but a smaller percentage of forces engaged. Most died aboard Shoho when she capsized and sank, 638 men trapped inside or dragged down by suction. Japanese naval culture emphasized going down with the ship. Many officers and senior enlisted men chose to remain aboard rather than abandon their posts, even when rescue was possible. This produced an honorable death by Japanese standards, but also represented a waste of experienced personnel who could have continued contributing to the war effort. The Americans, by contrast, had no cultural prohibition against abandoning sinking ships. Survival was emphasized over glory. This practical approach meant more American sailors survived to fight again, accumulating experience that made them more effective with each battle. The Japanese emphasis on death before dishonor ensured that experience died with the men who possessed it. The psychological impact of Coral Sea on its survivors varied widely. Some men carried the trauma for decades, suffering nightmares and anxiety that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, but in 1942 was simply called combat fatigue or shell shock. Others processed their experiences more successfully, integrating them into their life stories without lasting psychological damage. Many credited their survival to luck, to God, to the skill of their shipmates, to random chance. They'd been in the right place at the right moment when bombs fell, or they'd been assigned to damage control parties that kept them away from the worst explosions. They'd survived because someone else had died in their place, a burden of guilt that some carried forever. Lexington survivors in particular struggled with survivor's guilt. Why had they been topside when the explosions came? Why had they survived when so many friends died below decks? There were no good answers, only the silent acknowledgement that war was random and cruel. The annual reunions of Coral Sea veterans, which began in the late 1940s and continued into the 21st century, provided community and healing for many survivors. They gathered to remember fallen comrades, to share stories that only other veterans could truly understand, to process experiences that had shaped their lives. The reunions grew smaller each year as age and illness took their toll. By the 2000s, only a handful of veterans remained, elderly men in their 80s and 90s who'd been young sailors in 1942. The last known American survivor of the Battle of the Coral Sea died in 2021 at age 99, taking with him the final living memory of Lady Lex's death and the desperate carrier duel that changed the Pacific War. Their stories survive in oral histories, written memoirs, and the historical record. But the men themselves are gone now, joining their shipmates who died in May 1942 in waters that no longer remember their sacrifice. May 10, 1942, Canberra, Australia. Prime Minister John Curtin stood before Parliament to announce that the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby had been thwarted by American naval forces in the Coral Sea. The relief in his voice was palpable. For months, Australia had watched Japanese forces sweep southward. Malaya fallen, Singapore captured, the Dutch East Indies occupied, Rabaul turned into a major Japanese base only 700 miles from Australia's northeast coast. Port Moresby represented the last barrier. If it fell, Japanese bombers would reach Brisbane, Townsville, Cairns. Every major population center in northeastern Australia would be under threat. Curtin had been demanding more resources for Australian defense, pleading with Churchill to return Australian divisions from the Middle East, negotiating with Roosevelt for American military assistance. The Battle of the Coral Sea represented the first time since the war began that Japanese southward expansion had been definitively stopped. It wasn't just an American victory. It was Australia's survival. The strategic geography made Port Moresby's importance undeniable. The town itself was insignificant, a small administrative center on the southern coast of New Guinea with a population of a few thousand, but its location gave it immense strategic value. Port Moresby possessed the only suitable harbor on New Guinea's southern coast, the only location where large ships could dock and unload supplies. More critically, it had airfields that could accommodate bombers. From Port Moresby, Japanese aircraft could reach Australia's northeastern cities with fighter escort, something impossible from Rabaul due to distance. If Japan captured Port Moresby, they could establish a bomber offensive against Australian population centers and industrial facilities, potentially forcing Australia to withdraw from the war or accept Japanese demands. The Coral Sea battle ensured this nightmare scenario never occurred. Australian cities remained beyond Japanese bomber range, and Port Moresby became an Allied base instead of a Japanese one. The broader strategic implications extended far beyond preventing a bombing campaign. Australia's role in the Pacific War depended entirely on the continent remaining secure as an Allied base of operations. General Douglas MacArthur had established his Southwest Pacific headquarters in Brisbane after evacuating from the Philippines. American forces were beginning to deploy to Australia in large numbers. Eventually, more than 500,000 American servicemen would pass through Australian ports and bases. These forces needed secure logistics infrastructure, training facilities, supply depots, hospitals, and airfields. All of this was only possible because Australia itself was secure. If Port Moresby had fallen and Japanese bombers had begun hitting Australian cities, this massive buildup would have been impossible. MacArthur's entire Southwest Pacific strategy, the drive from Australia through New Guinea and the Philippines toward Japan, depended on Australia remaining unthreatened. The Battle of the Coral Sea made that strategy possible. Australian forces had contributed directly to the Coral Sea victory through their Coastwatcher network, though this contribution remained classified for years after the battle. Australian military personnel and civilian volunteers had been stationed throughout the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and other Pacific islands before the Japanese occupation. Many remained behind when Japanese forces arrived, hiding in the jungle and observing enemy movements. These coast watchers used radio sets to transmit intelligence about Japanese ship movements, troop dispositions, and aircraft flights. Their reports provided crucial early warning that helped American forces track Japanese operations. Before Coral Sea Coastwatcher reports confirmed the Tulagi landing and provided information about the Port Moresby invasion convoy's composition and course. During the battle, Coastwatchers transmitted sighting reports that supplemented aerial reconnaissance. After the battle, they confirmed that Japanese forces had withdrawn. This intelligence network, operated primarily by Australians, represented Australia's direct contribution to stopping Operation Mo. The land campaign that followed Coral Sea demonstrated Australia's continuing vulnerability. Despite the naval victory, Japanese forces, unable to capture Port Moresby by sea, attempted to seize it by land. In July 1942, Japanese troops landed on New Guinea's northeast coast and began advancing over the Owen Stanley Mountains via the Kokoda Track, a primitive trail through some of the world's most difficult terrain. Australian militia units, poorly equipped and undermanned, fought a desperate delaying action through mountain jungles, slowing the Japanese advance until Australian regular army divisions could arrive. The campaign became one of the most brutal of the Pacific War, fought in disease-ridden jungle, at high altitude, with minimal supplies, under conditions that killed men from exhaustion and tropical illness as surely as enemy bullets. Australian forces eventually stopped the Japanese advance just 30 miles from Port Moresby, then drove them back over the mountains in a campaign that lasted into early 1943. This land battle was only possible because Coral Sea had prevented Japanese forces from simply sailing into Port Moresby Harbor unopposed. The psychological impact of Coral Sea on Australian morale was profound and lasting. Since December 1941, Australians had watched an unbroken string of Japanese victories with growing alarm. Darwin had been bombed by the same carrier force that struck Pearl Harbor. Japanese submarines had operated in Australian waters. Thousands of Australian soldiers had been captured at Singapore. The nation faced the genuine possibility of invasion or isolation. Coral Sea broke this pattern of defeats. It demonstrated that Japanese forces could be stopped, that American military assistance was real and effective, that Australia would not be abandoned to face Japan alone. Newspapers celebrated the victory. Church services offered prayers of thanksgiving. The relief was tangible. Australia was safe, at least for now, and the path toward eventual victory had begun. The commemoration of Coral Sea in Australian culture contrasted sharply with American remembrance. In Australia, Battle of Coral Sea Day became an annual observance, celebrated on May 8th with ceremonies honoring both American and Australian personnel who'd fought in the battle. Schools taught the battle's significance. Veterans organizations maintained its memory. The Royal Australian Navy named ships HMAS Australia and HMAS Canberra after cruisers that had fought at Coral Sea, continuing a tradition of honoring the battle. In America, by contrast, Coral Sea was quickly overshadowed by the more decisive victory at Midway, 1 month later. American history books mentioned Coral Sea briefly as a preliminary to Midway, if they mentioned it at all. This disparity reflected different strategic perspectives. For America, Coral Sea was one battle among many in a global war. For Australia, it was the battle that saved the nation. The historical debate about whether Japan actually intended to invade Australia has raged among scholars for decades, but this debate somewhat misses the point. Whether Japanese strategists planned full occupation of the Australian continent or merely sought to isolate it from Allied support, the result would have been catastrophic for Australia. Isolation would have meant Japanese control of sea lanes, interdiction of trade, bombing of cities, and potential starvation of a nation dependent on imported oil and industrial goods. Even without actual invasion, Australia would have been forced to consider whether continuing the war was sustainable. The Battle of the Coral Sea prevented both scenarios, invasion and isolation, by stopping Japanese southern expansion at Port Moresby. The question of Japanese intentions matters less than the reality of Japanese capabilities. After Coral Sea, those capabilities were permanently limited. Japan never again threatened Australia directly. The economic dimension of Australia's security after Coral Sea manifested in remarkable ways. With the threat of Japanese southern expansion eliminated, Australia became the primary Allied base in the Southwest Pacific. This required massive infrastructure development, new ports, expanded airfields, supply depots, hospitals, training camps, communication facilities. Australian industry converted to war production, building ships, aircraft components, uniforms, equipment. Australian agriculture increased production to feed both civilian population and Allied military forces. Australian women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers as men joined the armed forces. All of this economic mobilization was only possible because Australia itself was secure. If Port Moresby had fallen and Japanese bombers were hitting Australian cities, this economic engine would have ground to a halt under the demands of civil defense and population protection. The Battle of the Coral Sea didn't just save Australia militarily. It enabled Australia to contribute economically to the Allied war effort in ways that would have been impossible under direct threat. By war's end, Australia's survival and transformation into a major Allied base had changed the nation permanently. The 500,000 American servicemen who'd passed through Australia created cultural connections that would shape Australian-American relations for generations. The industrial development undertaken during the war created manufacturing capacity that would support post-war economic growth. The military expansion that built a modern Australian Navy and Air Force created defense capabilities that made Australia a regional power. Most fundamentally, the experience of facing existential threat and surviving created a national narrative of resilience under pressure. The Battle of the Coral Sea sat at the center of this narrative. the moment when Australia's fate hung in the balance, and American naval forces, fighting desperately against superior numbers, tipped the balance toward survival. For Australians, Coral Sea would never be overshadowed by later battles. It was and remained the battle that saved the nation. May 8th, 1942, 0900 hours. Lieutenant Junior Grade Stanley Swede Vejtasa sat in the cockpit of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber aboard USS Yorktown, running through his pre-flight checks one final time. The aircraft around him represented the cutting edge of naval aviation technology in 1942, though in later years they would seem primitive and inadequate. The Dauntless was an all-metal monoplane with a crew of 2 pilot and rear-seat gunner, capable of carrying 1,000-pound bomb or smaller ordnance loads. Its Pratt & Whitney R1A20 radial engine produced 1,000 horsepower, giving it a maximum speed of 255 miles per hour and a range of roughly 1,000 miles with external fuel tanks. For dive bombing, it used hydraulically operated perforated dive flaps, Swiss cheese flaps that created drag to prevent the aircraft from exceeding safe diving speeds. Vejtasa loved the Dauntless. It was stable, reliable, and accurate, but he also knew its limitations. The same stability that made it a good dive bomber made it vulnerable in combat. It couldn't outturn enemy fighters or outrun them. Survival depended on formations staying tight and rear gunners being alert. The technology gap between American and Japanese carrier aircraft in May 1940 too was complex and often misunderstood. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter outperformed the American F4F Wildcat in almost every measurable category. The Zero could reach 332 miles per hour versus the Wildcat's 318. The Zero could climb faster, turn tighter, and had longer range. Japanese pilots loved the Zero and considered it the finest carrier fighter in the world. But these advantages came with fatal trade-offs. The Zero achieved its performance through extreme weight reduction, no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal structural reinforcement. A few hits from 50 caliber machine guns could set a Zero on fire or tear off critical flight surfaces. The Wildcat, by contrast, was heavy and rugged. It had armor behind the pilot's seat. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could take hits without exploding. It could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero and keep flying. This durability, combined with the thatch-weave tactic that emphasized mutual support over individual dogfighting, gradually negated the Zero's performance advantages. The torpedo problem that plagued American naval aviation at Coral Sea represented one of the war's greatest technical failures. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo was supposed to be a reliable weapon, thoroughly tested before the war. It wasn't. The torpedo suffered from multiple defects that rendered it almost useless in combat. The magnetic influence exploder, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel where the explosion would break the ship's back, frequently detonated prematurely or not at all. The contact exploder was weak. Even when torpedoes hit, they often failed to detonate. The depth-keeping mechanism was unreliable, causing torpedoes to run too deep and pass under targets. The assembly was fragile. Dropping from an aircraft flying over 100 miles per hour often damaged internal mechanisms. Pilots at Coral Sea reported watching their torpedoes porpoise across the water, circle randomly, or simply sink without running. The Japanese Type 91 aerial torpedo, by contrast, worked with reliable effectiveness approaching 80%. This technical disparity meant American torpedo bombers suffered heavy casualties while achieving minimal results, while Japanese torpedo bombers achieved devastating hits on Lexington and Yorktown. The Mark 13 wouldn't be fully fixed until late 1943. 2 years of combat with a defective weapon that cost hundreds of lives. Radar technology in May 1942 remained primitive by later standards, but was improving rapidly based on combat experience. Lexington carried a CXAM radar set, while Yorktown had the slightly improved CXAME. 1. These systems could detect large ships at 50 to 80 miles under ideal conditions, and aircraft at 35 to 100 miles depending on the target's altitude and atmospheric conditions. The displays were crude, a circular cathode ray tube showing blips that indicated targets but provided limited information about altitude or precise position. Radar operators required significant training and experience to interpret the displays correctly, distinguishing between friendly and enemy aircraft, real contacts, and false returns caused by weather. Despite these limitations, radar gave American carriers a crucial advantage at Coral Sea. They detected incoming Japanese strikes at 68 miles, providing precious minutes to launch fighters and prepare defenses. The Japanese carriers had no radar, relying entirely on visual lookouts who might spot incoming attackers at 10 to 15 miles if visibility was good. This technology gap would only widen as the war progressed. Communication systems revealed another area where technology constrained operations. Aircraft radios in 1942 were short-ranged, unreliable, and prone to interference. The standard aircraft radio had a range of perhaps 50 to 75 miles under ideal conditions, less in practice. Static atmospheric interference and the limitations of 1940s vacuum tube technology meant that radio communications were often garbled or impossible. Pilots frequently couldn't communicate with their carriers, couldn't coordinate with other aircraft in their formation, and sometimes couldn't even talk to their wingmen. This communication breakdown contributed to the chaos of Coral Sea's air battles. Strike coordinators struggled to maintain formation cohesion when they couldn't talk to their pilots. Fighter directors aboard ships struggled to vector fighters to intercept raids when radio communications failed. The Japanese suffered similar communication limitations. Both sides fought through this technological fog, achieving coordination through pre-briefed plans and visual signals rather than reliable radio communication. Navigation technology placed extraordinary demands on pilots flying over featureless ocean. The primary navigation method was dead reckoning, starting from a known position, then calculating current position based on compass heading, indicated airspeed, elapsed time, and estimates of wind drift. Errors accumulated quickly. A pilot might think he was 20 miles from his carrier when he was actually 50 miles away, having drifted off course due to winds aloft that he couldn't see or measure accurately. Running out of fuel before reaching the carrier was a constant fear. Many Coral Sea pilots ditched in the ocean when they couldn't find their ships, some within sight of rescue, but many disappearing without trace. Both carriers had YEZB homing beacons, radio transmitters that broadcast directional signals allowing aircraft to home toward the ship, but these had limited range and could guide aircraft only for the final 30 to 40 miles of their return flight. Long-range navigation depended on pilot skill, experience, and luck. Bad weather, combat damage to instruments, or simple navigational errors sent many aircraft to watery graves with perfectly functioning engines. The carrier aircraft of 1942 were transitional designs, clearly superior to the biplanes of the 1930s, but inferior to the specialized aircraft that would appear later in the war. The TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, which equipped American squadrons at Coral Sea, was already obsolete by May 1942, but remained in service because its replacement wasn't yet available. The Devastator could barely exceed 100 miles per hour when carrying a torpedo, making it hideously vulnerable to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. It had minimal defensive armament, one fixed forward-firing 30-caliber machine gun for the pilot, one flexible 30-caliber gun for the rear seat gunner. Against Zeros and Japanese anti-aircraft fire, Devastators died in swarms. Their replacement, the TBM Avenger, was beginning to enter service with better speed, better armament, and better survivability. By late 1942, the Devastator would be withdrawn from frontline service, its losses at Coral Sea and Midway having proven its inadequacy. But at Coral Sea, torpedo squadrons flew Devastators into combat, knowing they were likely to die. The courage this required was extraordinary. The Japanese aircraft at Coral Sea represented the peak of pre-war naval aviation development. The Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber was an excellent aircraft, accurate, reliable, capable of delivering bombs with precision that approached later guided munitions. The Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber was fast enough to survive and accurate enough to achieve consistent hits with the reliable Type 91 torpedo. The Zero fighter has already been discussed. All three aircraft types were superior to their American equivalents in some ways, though they shared the Japanese design philosophy of achieving performance through weight reduction rather than robustness. But Japanese aircraft development had essentially stagnated. The Val, Kate, and Zero would remain Japan's primary carrier aircraft throughout the war, with only minor modifications. Japan lacked the industrial capacity and resources to develop a new generation of carrier aircraft, while simultaneously replacing combat losses and maintaining production. American aircraft development, by contrast, would produce revolutionary improvements. By 1944, American carriers would operate F-6F Hellcats, TBM Avengers, and SB-2C Helldivers that were vastly superior to their 1942 predecessors. This technological evolution, driven by American industrial capacity and rapid development cycles, would contribute significantly to the growing American advantage in carrier warfare. The human interface with this technology revealed the physical demands of carrier aviation. Pilots flew missions lasting 4 to 6 hours in cramped cockpits, wearing heavy flight suits and Mae West life preservers, breathing oxygen through masks at high altitude, enduring G-forces during combat maneuvers that degrade their vision and threatened consciousness. The noise was incredible. Radial engines produced sound levels that would cause permanent hearing damage. The vibration was constant, every bolt and rivet transmitting engine vibration through the airframe into the pilot's body. The cold at altitude was numbing despite flight suits, fingers stiffening on controls. Combat added terror and adrenaline, the body's stress response dumping hormones into the bloodstream that produced shaking hands, rapid heartbeat, tunnel vision. Pilots returned from missions physically and emotionally exhausted, yet they had to fly again the next day, and the day after that, for months on end. The technology enabled carrier warfare, but human endurance determined whether that warfare could be sustained. The Battle of the Coral Sea was fought with technology that would seem primitive within 2 years, yet it represented the state-of-the-art in May 1942. The limitations of this technology, defective torpedoes, primitive radar, inadequate communications, marginal aircraft, shaped every aspect of the battle. Both sides struggled with technological constraints as much as they fought each other. The side that could overcome these limitations through better tactics, better training, and faster technological improvement would ultimately prevail. America's advantage lay not in superior technology at Coral Sea. In many ways, Japanese equipment was better, but in the industrial and developmental capacity to improve technology faster than Japan could. The aircraft and systems that fought at Coral Sea were the foundation. The lessons learned there would drive improvements that would transform carrier warfare into the overwhelmingly effective system that dominated the Pacific by 1944. 1937, Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, Etajima. Commander Minoru Genda stood before a class of naval officer candidates, drawing carrier formations on a blackboard and explaining the doctrine that would guide Japanese naval aviation into war. The carrier's purpose is offensive action. Genda lectured, his voice carrying conviction born of years studying under the Navy's aviation pioneers. We concentrate maximum striking power for the decisive blow that destroys the enemy fleet in a single battle. He drew arrows showing how multiple carriers would launch coordinated strikes, overwhelming enemy defenses through sheer numbers and perfect execution. The side that strikes first with superior force will win. Therefore, we train for the perfect first strike, surprise, coordination, overwhelming violence. The students took notes furiously, absorbing doctrine that emphasized offense over defense, concentration over dispersion, decisive battle over attritional warfare. This was the Japanese way, the lesson learned from Admiral Togo's victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, refined and adapted for carrier aviation. It was elegant, aggressive, and ultimately flawed. Simultaneously, at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, American naval officers were developing very different carrier doctrine based on different strategic assumptions. American planners understood that any Pacific War would be a long conflict measured in years, not months. America's industrial advantage meant that losses could be replaced, while Japan's industrial limitations made every lost ship potentially irreplaceable. Therefore, American doctrine emphasized preservation of force, defensive depth, and gradual attrition of enemy strength. Carriers would be valuable assets, protected by layers of escorts and combat air patrol, used carefully to avoid unnecessary risks. Decisive battle was desirable but not essential. Wearing down Japanese strength through repeated engagements that inflicted unsustainable losses would achieve victory, even if no single battle was decisive. This philosophy reflected American strategic culture, pragmatic, industrial, focused on logistics and sustainability rather than glorious decisive battles. The Battle of the Coral Sea revealed these philosophical differences in concrete ways. When Japanese carriers located American ships, their response was to launch immediately with maximum strength, 69 aircraft representing almost every available bomber and torpedo plane. The strike was designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers, accepting that some attackers would be shot down but ensuring that enough would get through to inflict crippling damage. This all-or-nothing approach reflected Japanese doctrine: concentrate maximum offensive power at the point of decision. The Americans, by contrast, retained fighters for combat air patrol over their own task force, even while launching strikes. American doctrine emphasized balanced allocation between offense and defense. This produced a smaller striking force than maximum effort would have allowed, but it also meant better protection for the carriers themselves. Both approaches had merits. The Japanese achieved more concentrated striking power. The Americans achieved better defensive resilience. Damage control philosophy revealed even starker contrasts. Japanese carrier design emphasized preventing damage through armor, compartmentalization, and structural protection. The assumption was that a properly designed ship shouldn't need extensive damage control parties because good design would minimize damage. Japanese damage control teams were relatively small, specialized crews located strategically throughout the ship. When Shokaku took bomb hits at Coral Sea, these teams fought fires and contained flooding effectively, but they were limited in number and capability. American philosophy took the opposite approach. Assume the ship will be damaged, then organize large damage control parties with extensive training to deal with whatever happens. American carriers carried hundreds of trained damage control personnel organized into specialized parties: firefighters, repair parties, electrical teams, medical teams. When Yorktown took hits at Coral Sea, her damage control response was massive and immediate, dozens of trained men converging on damage sites to control fires, shore bulkheads, and maintain ship stability. This difference reflected broader cultural attitudes: Japanese faith in perfection and correct design, American acceptance of imperfection, and emphasis on adaptive response. Pilot training philosophies diverged even more dramatically, with consequences that would prove decisive. Japanese naval aviation selected candidates through rigorous testing, then trained them for 3 to 5 years in a program that emphasized perfection of technique. Washout rates were high. Only the best students completed training and received carrier qualifications. The result was an elite corps of supremely skilled pilots who could execute complex maneuvers with precision. But the system was inflexible and slow. Training facilities were limited. Instructors were scarce. The pipeline couldn't be expanded rapidly without degrading quality, which Japanese culture refused to accept. American pilot training took a more industrial approach. Selection was less rigorous. Training was standardized and compressed to 6 to 12 months. Quality varied more widely, but throughput was vastly higher. American training philosophy accepted that pilots didn't need to be perfect. They needed to be adequate and available in numbers that overwhelmed the enemy. A moderately skilled American pilot in a good aircraft using sound tactics could defeat a highly skilled Japanese pilot if the American had 2 wingmen supporting him. The strategic implications of these philosophical differences became clear through attrition analysis. Coral Sea cost Japan 70 to 7 aircraft and many experienced pilots. Japan's training system would take 6 months to a year to replace those losses with pilots of equivalent skill. Meanwhile, Japan's monthly aircraft production was approximately 150 aircraft. America lost 69 aircraft at Coral Sea, and while American pilots killed were also experienced and valuable, the training pipeline could replace them in 3 to 6 months. American monthly aircraft production was approximately 2,000 aircraft and accelerating. The mathematics were brutal. Japan fought a war of conservation, carefully husbanding resources that couldn't be replaced. America fought a war of attrition, accepting losses in the knowledge that replacements would arrive faster than the enemy could kill them. These different approaches to the war's fundamental arithmetic determined its outcome more than tactical brilliance or strategic insight. Risk tolerance manifested differently in each Navy's operational planning. Japanese plans for Coral Sea accepted significant risk to achieve strategic objectives. Sending carriers into restricted waters like the Coral Sea, where maneuver was constrained by geography and escape routes were limited, represented aggressive risk acceptance. If the operation succeeded, Port Moresby would fall and Australia would be threatened. If it failed, carriers might be lost in waters where they couldn't be easily recovered or repaired. Japanese planners accepted this risk because they believed in the decisive battle concept. Bold action could win wars. Caution could only prolong them. American planning at Coral Sea was more conservative despite Fletcher's aggressive execution. Enmitz committed carriers to stop Operation Mo, but he provided Fletcher with intelligence, positioned his forces carefully, and emphasized that preserving the carriers mattered as much as stopping the invasion. Fletcher could withdraw if the situation became untenable. This operational flexibility reflected American strategic philosophy: fight when conditions favor you, withdraw when they don't. Wait for industrial production to shift the balance decisively. The concept of acceptable losses revealed another philosophical divide. Japanese naval culture viewed ship losses as failures that required explanation and often punishment for commanders. Losing Shoho at Coral Sea was seen as a defeat despite the operational context suggesting it was an acceptable loss in exchange for damaging American carriers. This cultural attitude discouraged risk-taking and created pressure for commanders to seek perfect victories rather than accept messy compromises. American naval culture was more forgiving of losses if strategic objectives were achieved. Losing Lexington was tragic, but stopping Operation MO was more important. Fletcher wasn't relieved for losing a carrier. He was commended for achieving the strategic objective despite the loss. This cultural difference in how losses were interpreted created different operational behaviors. Japanese commanders became increasingly cautious after Coral Sea and Midway, while American commanders became more willing to accept losses as the price of offensive action. The role of carriers in fleet composition reflected different naval philosophies rooted in pre-war development. Japanese doctrine still elevated the battleship as the ultimate naval weapon, with carriers serving primarily to support battleship engagements by neutralizing enemy carriers and air power. Operation Mo included battleships in supporting roles, and the Midway operation would feature Yamato and other battleships in the main body. This reflected Japanese adherence to traditional naval theory despite the clear evidence that carriers had become the dominant capital ships. American doctrine evolved faster, partly because necessity forced innovation after Pearl Harbor. With most battleships lost or damaged, carriers became the Pacific Fleet's primary striking arm by default. American planners quickly recognized that carrier aviation had displaced the battleship as the central element of naval warfare. By mid-1942, American carrier doctrine had evolved to treat carriers as the main battle force, with all other ships supporting carrier operations. This doctrinal evolution, forced by circumstance but embraced strategically, gave America a conceptual advantage that matched its industrial superiority. The philosophical differences between Japanese and American naval doctrine at Coral Sea can be summarized in their responses to the battle's outcome. Japanese commanders reported a tactical victory, more tonnage sunk, more casualties inflicted, but postponed Operation Mo because they had lost control of the air over the Coral Sea. Despite claiming victory, they withdrew. American commanders reported an ambiguous tactical result, but achieved their strategic objective. Port Moresby remained allied. Operation Mo failed, so they considered it a strategic victory. Despite losing more tonnage, they'd won. This difference in how victory was measured, tactical results versus strategic objectives, reflected the fundamental philosophical divide. Japan fought for perfect execution and decisive tactical victories. America fought for strategic objectives achieved through whatever means worked. In a long attritional war, the American philosophy proved superior. Perfect execution was nice when achievable, but adequate execution that achieved objectives was sufficient. The nation that could sustain adequate performance indefinitely would defeat the nation that required perfect performance to succeed. May 19, 1942. Station Hippo, Pearl Harbor. Commander Joseph Rochefort sat at his desk, reading the latest intercepts with a mixture of excitement and dread. His team had broken enough of Japanese naval code JN-25 to detect another major operation in planning, this one designated AF. Traffic analysis suggested it involved most of Japan's remaining carriers and would occur in early June. The critical question was the target. AF appeared repeatedly in intercepts, but what did AF mean? Some analysts believed AF meant the Aleutian Islands. Others thought it might be Hawaii itself. Rochefort believed it was Midway, a small atoll northwest of Hawaii that would be a logical next objective for Japan after Coral Sea's failure. But he needed proof, something concrete, that would convince Nimitz to commit America's remaining carriers based on his analysis. Rochefort conceived an elegant solution. Have Midway send a fake plain text message reporting water supply problems, then watch for Japanese intercepts mentioning AF having water problems. It was risky. If the Japanese detected the ruse, they'd know their code was broken. But without proof, Nimitz might not position carriers at Midway, and the opportunity would be lost. The water message was transmitted from Midway on May 20th in plain language that anyone monitoring American communications could intercept. Midway reports water supply problems due to contamination. Request emergency resupply. 2 days later, Station Waipo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF is short of fresh water. The proof was conclusive. AF meant Midway. Rochefort immediately drafted a report for Nimitz with detailed analysis of Operation MI. Japanese objective was Midway. Timing early June, forces include 4 to 5 fleet carriers. Supporting elements include battleships and invasion troops. NMEMs read the report, asked probing questions to test Rochefort's confidence level, then made his decision. All available carriers would deploy to Midway immediately. The Pacific Fleet would set an ambush based on intelligence that gave them perfect foreknowledge of Japanese plans. It was the kind of advantage that determined battles, the kind that Coral Sea's intelligence had begun to provide, and that would now be exploited even more decisively. The intelligence war that culminated at Midway had begun in the Coral Sea, where Station Hippo's decryption of Operation MO messages first demonstrated the value of breaking JN-25. But the Japanese remained unaware their codes were compromised. After Coral Sea, Japanese communications security analysis concluded that American positioning had been lucky, perhaps aided by traffic analysis or direction finding, but not by actual code breaking. This catastrophic intelligence failure, failing to recognize that your codes are broken, was arguably worse than losing ships at Coral Sea. If Japanese cryptographers had realized JN-25 was compromised, they would have introduced a new codebook immediately, blinding American intelligence for months while Station Hippo worked to break the new system. But Japanese confidence in their code's security was so complete that they didn't even consider the possibility of compromise. They kept using JN-25 through Midway, through Guadalcanal, through 1943, giving American intelligence an advantage that shaped every major battle. The organizational structure of American signals, intelligence contributed significantly to its success. Station Hippo at Pearl Harbor worked closely with Station Cast in Australia and OP-20G in Washington, sharing intercepts and cryptanalytic breakthroughs in a cooperative network that accelerated code breaking. When one station made progress on recovering a code group, they shared it with the others. When traffic volume exceeded one station's capacity, intercepts were redistributed for processing. This cooperative approach maximized efficiency and prevented duplication of effort, but it also created bureaucratic tensions. OP-20G in Washington wanted to centralize control, arguing that cryptanalysis should be managed from the capital. Rochefort resisted, arguing that Hypo needed operational independence to provide timely intelligence to Pacific Fleet commanders. The tension between centralization and local control would eventually cost Rochefort his position, but during Coral Sea and Midway, his operational independence allowed rapid analysis and direct communication with Nimitz that proved invaluable. Japanese signals intelligence, by contrast, suffered from organizational fragmentation and cultural barriers. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army ran separate intelligence services that barely cooperated. Within the Navy, different fleet commands maintained their own intelligence sections, with limited sharing of information. Japanese cryptanalysts worked on Allied codes with some success. They'd broken several Allied codes during the war, but they never achieved the systematic breakthrough that American cryptanalysts accomplished against JN. 2.5. More critically, Japanese intelligence culture didn't emphasize the kind of systematic traffic analysis and pattern recognition that Hypo used so effectively. Japanese intelligence focused on tactical intercepts and immediate operational intelligence, missing the strategic patterns that Hypo detected by analyzing hundreds of messages looking for long-term trends. This organizational and cultural difference in how intelligence was conceived and used contributed significantly to American advantage. The human element of intelligence work deserves recognition that it rarely received during the war or after. Station Hypo's cryptanalysts were mathematicians, linguists, radio operators, clerks, a diverse group united by mission. They worked in uncomfortable conditions, breathing recycled air in a basement that smelled of cigarette smoke and body odor, hunched over adding machines and card files for 20-hour shifts. The work was mind-numbing and intellectually exhausting simultaneously, processing thousands of intercepts looking for patterns, testing hypothetical code group meanings, checking and rechecking calculations. Mistakes could waste weeks of work or produce intelligence that got sailors killed. The pressure was intense. Yet these men, and a few women in clerical roles, produced intelligence that changed the war's trajectory. They weren't warriors in the traditional sense. They never saw combat, never faced enemy fire. But their contribution to American victory was as significant as any carrier pilots or admirals. The intelligence victories at Coral Sea and Midway created a template that would be exploited throughout the war. American submarines received intelligence derived from decrypted Japanese messages, allowing them to position along convoy routes and ambush Japanese supply ships. American forces preparing for amphibious operations received intelligence about Japanese defensive preparations, reducing casualties by identifying strong points and defensive weaknesses. American commanders planning operations received intelligence about Japanese troop movements, supply levels, and operational intentions, allowing them to time attacks from maximum advantage. This intelligence superiority, built on the foundation of Station Hypo's cryptanalytic success, gave America what military theorists call information dominance, knowing significantly more about the enemy than the enemy knows about you. In modern warfare, information dominance provides enormous advantage. In 1942, it was revolutionary. Rochefort's personal fate after Midway revealed the bureaucratic costs of success. Despite his intelligence achievements at Coral Sea and Midway, Rochefort faced opposition from OP-20G in Washington, which resented Hypo's independence and wanted credit for the intelligence victories. After Midway, OP-20G successfully lobbied to have Rochefort relieved and reassigned to shore duty commanding a floating dry dock in California, a dead-end assignment designed to end his cryptanalytic career. Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal for his intelligence work, but the recommendation was denied due to bureaucratic opposition. Rochefort spent the rest of the war in insignificant positions, his contributions unrecognized and unrewarded. Not until 1985, 13 years after his death, did the Navy finally award him the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously. His treatment represented one of the war's great injustices. A man whose intelligence work saved thousands of lives and changed the war's outcome was pushed aside by bureaucrats jealous of his success. The lasting impact of signals intelligence on the Pacific War cannot be overstated. From Coral Sea through war's end, American cryptanalytic success against Japanese codes provided continuous intelligence advantage. The Japanese never fixed their code security problems. They never detected the compromise of JN-25. They never implemented communication security procedures that would have blinded American intelligence. This failure represents perhaps the greatest intelligence catastrophe of the war, worse than Pearl Harbor in its long-term consequences. Pearl Harbor cost America several battleships and 3,000 lives. The failure to secure Japanese codes gave America an intelligence advantage that cost Japan the war. Every major Japanese operation was compromised by American foreknowledge. Every major Japanese defeat, Coral Sea, Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, was shaped by American intelligence derived from broken codes. The men in Station Hippo's basement won the Pacific War as surely as the pilots and sailors who fought the battles, and they did it with adding machines and card files instead of bombs and torpedoes. The intelligence war at Coral Sea and beyond also revealed an uncomfortable truth about modern warfare. Technical and intellectual advantages can matter more than courage or tactical skill. Japanese pilots at Coral Sea were skilled, brave, and determined. They executed their attacks with precision and accepted casualties with stoic courage. But they fought blind, without knowledge of American positions or intentions, because American intelligence had detected Operation MO before it began. American pilots at Coral Sea were equally brave but benefited from intelligence that positioned their carriers for ambush and gave them forewarning of Japanese movements. Courage was necessary but not sufficient for victory. Information was the decisive factor. This lesson, learned in May 1942 in the Coral Sea, would shape military thinking for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The nation that knows more and understands more will defeat the nation that fights harder. Station Hippo proved it. Alternate timeline, May 7th, 1942, 0700 hours. In this version of history, the Japanese scout plane that found USS Neosho and USS Sims makes a different identification error. Instead of reporting them as a carrier and cruiser, he flies another 30 miles south before turning back. At 0730, another scout from carrier Zuikaku spots Yorktown and Lexington through a gap in the clouds, 150 miles from the Japanese carriers. The contact report goes out immediately, correctly identifying 2 American fleet carriers. Admiral Hara orders maximum effort launch at 0800 hours, a full hour earlier than the historical launch. 69 Japanese aircraft form up and head south. In this timeline, the Japanese strike finds the American carriers before American scouts find the Japanese. The Americans are caught launching their own scouts, their decks crowded with aircraft, their combat air patrol still climbing to altitude. The resulting disaster costs both American carriers sunk within an hour. Task Force 17 ceases to exist. The Port Moresby invasion proceeds unopposed. Australia comes under direct threat. History pivots on 30 miles of ocean and a scout pilot's identification error. Alternate timeline 2, May 8, 1942, 1000 hours. In this version, carrier Zuikaku doesn't enter the weather front that hid her from American aircraft. Instead, she maintains clear weather position 5 miles from Shokaku. American torpedo bombers find both Japanese carriers instead of only Shokaku. The concentrated torpedo attack overwhelms Zuikaku's defenses. She takes 4 torpedo hits in rapid succession, flooding rapidly, losing power. Shokaku still takes her historical bomb damage. Both Japanese carriers are crippled, neither able to conduct flight operations. Without carriers to protect them, Japanese commanders are forced to withdraw the entire MO operation immediately. The Port Moresby invasion is not just postponed, but canceled permanently. More significantly, Japan loses 2 fleet carriers, instead of having Zuikaku available undamaged. At Midway 1 month later, Japan fields only 2 carriers, Akagi and Kaga, versus America's 3. The Battle of Midway becomes a devastating Japanese defeat, even without the lucky circumstances that historically destroyed 3 Japanese carriers in minutes. The Pacific War's trajectory shifts months earlier. Alternate timeline 3. May 8, 1940, 1247 hours. In this version, the motor generator that sparked Lexington's gasoline vapor explosion doesn't start. The accumulated vapor continues building up harmlessly. vented slowly through emergency procedures that damage control parties implement successfully. Lexington's damage from Japanese bombs and torpedoes proves manageable. She returns to Pearl Harbor with Yorktown for repairs. Both carriers are available for the Midway operation in June. America fields 4 carriers at Midway versus Japan's 4. The battle becomes even more decisive. All 4 Japanese carriers sunk while America loses perhaps 1 carrier instead of Yorktown alone. Japanese carrier aviation is destroyed completely by early June 1942, instead of being gradually worn down through 1943. The strategic implications are enormous. American carrier dominance established a year earlier, accelerating the Pacific War's timetable, potentially ending the war in late 1945. Alternate timeline 4. May 1942, Station Hippo fails to break enough of JN 25 to detect Operation MO. Rochefort's team has made progress on the code, but not enough to identify the objective or timing. Admiral Nimitz has no warning that Japanese forces are moving toward Port Moresby. Task Force 17 is positioned incorrectly, perhaps near the Solomons or east of New Guinea, unable to intercept in time. The Port Moresby invasion succeeds unopposed. By June 1942, Japanese bombers are flying from Port Moresby airfields to hit Townsville, Cairns, and other Australian targets. Australian Prime Minister Curtin demands return of all Australian divisions from the Middle East, immediately. The British lose critical Australian forces at El Alamein, potentially losing North Africa. American forces cannot use Australia as a secure base. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific strategy becomes impossible. The entire Allied strategic posture in the Pacific collapses. The war extends years longer as America is forced to develop alternative approaches without a secure southern anchor. Alternate timeline 5, May 8, 1940, to the American dive bomber attack on Shokaku misses. Poor weather, navigation errors, or simple bad luck means that American aircraft can't find the Japanese carriers despite searching. They jettison their bombs and return to Yorktown and Lexington with empty weapons racks. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft successfully attack both American carriers. Both Lexington and Yorktown are sunk. America loses 2 fleet carriers in exchange for nothing. No Japanese ships damaged or sunk. The psychological impact is crushing. Nimitz faces criticism for committing scarce carriers based on intelligence that proved inadequate. The Port Moresby invasion succeeds unopposed. Japanese expansion continues unchecked. When Midway comes in June, America fields only 1 carrier, Enterprise, versus Japan's 6, including Shokaku and Zuikaku. The Battle of Midway becomes a Japanese victory. American carrier strength is reduced to a single ship. The war's trajectory shifts dramatically toward Japan. American strategy must focus purely on defense while waiting for new carriers from the construction program. A delay of months or years during which Japanese control of the Pacific solidifies. The probability analysis that historians have applied to Coral Sea reveals how contingent the battle's outcome was. Neither side had overwhelming advantages. Both made mistakes that could have been fatal. Both benefited from luck at crucial moments. Historians estimate that Japan had perhaps a 60 to 40% advantage based on forces engaged, quality of equipment, and skill of personnel. Shoho's loss, Zuikaku's weather luck, and Lexington's fatal internal explosions shifted the outcome from probable Japanese victory to ambiguous result that achieved American strategic objectives. Change any one of these factors and history pivots. This contingency is uncomfortable for people who prefer historical narratives of inevitable outcomes, but it reflects the reality of warfare. Small chances determine large outcomes. Coral Sea could easily have resulted in complete disaster for America or complete disaster for Japan. Instead, it resulted in an ambiguous tactical exchange that favored America strategically. The battle, balanced on a knife's edge, and luck determined which way it fell. The counterfactual scenarios also reveal the importance of intelligence in determining outcomes. Almost every scenario where American fortunes worsen significantly involves Station Hippo failing to provide adequate warning of Japanese movements. Intelligence, more than tactical skill or technical superiority, determined the battle's context. Fletcher knew where to position his carriers because Rochefort told him where Operation MO would occur. This foreknowledge provided an enormous advantage that tactical brilliance couldn't match. The counterfactuals where intelligence fails demonstrate how completely the actual battle depended on cryptanalytic success. Remove that advantage, and American prospects deteriorate rapidly. This suggests that Station Hapo's cryptanalysts were more responsible for American victory at Coral Sea than any admiral or pilot, because they created the conditions under which tactical success became possible. The cascade effects of different Coral Sea outcomes illustrate how single battles can determine war trajectories. If Coral Sea had gone badly wrong for America, both carriers lost, Port Moresby captured, Australia threatened, the entire Allied strategy in the Pacific would have collapsed. Without secure bases in Australia, without carrier strength to contest Japanese expansion, without time to bring industrial production online, America would have faced desperate choices: abandon the Pacific to focus on Europe, seek negotiated settlement with Japan, pour resources into crash carrier construction while accepting years of defensive warfare. None of these alternatives were attractive. Similarly, if Coral Sea had gone catastrophically wrong for Japan, both Shokaku and Zuikaku lost, invasion forces destroyed, major surface combatants sunk, the psychological impact on Japanese strategy would have been severe. The myth of Japanese invincibility would have collapsed months earlier. The Midway operation might have been canceled or significantly modified. The war's entire tempo would have changed. Single battles rarely determine wars alone, but they can create conditions where certain strategies become possible or impossible. Coral Sea was such a battle. The historical reality that actually occurred, ambiguous tactical outcome, strategic American victory, both sides bloodied but neither destroyed, may have been the most probable outcome given the forces and circumstances involved. But most probable doesn't mean inevitable. The battle could have gone very differently with small changes in timing, weather, intelligence, or luck. Understanding these counterfactuals helps illuminate how contingent history truly is. We study what happened, but we should also remember what might have happened, because the narrow margin between historical reality and alternate disaster or triumph reveals how fragile human accomplishments are. The Battle of the Coral Sea saved Australia, enabled Midway, and began turning the Pacific War toward Allied victory. But it almost didn't. 30 miles of ocean, a scout pilot's identification error, a motor generator's spark. Any of these could have changed everything. That we live in the timeline where things went right for America was not inevitable. It was fortune combined with skill, intelligence combined with courage, and industrial strength combined with operational execution. The battle that might have been reminds us how lucky we are that we're studying the battle that was. March 5, 2018, Philippine Sea. The research vessel Petrel, owned by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's estate, deployed its remotely operated underwater vehicle to a depth of 3,000 meters. The sonar had detected a large ship-shaped object resting on the seabed approximately 500 miles off the east coast of Australia. As the ROV's cameras illuminated the deep ocean darkness, the image that appeared on monitors above took everyone's breath away. USS Lexington lay on the bottom, 76 years after she'd sunk. The carrier rested upright, her hull remarkably intact despite the explosions that had killed her. The flight deck was clearly visible, recognition numbers still painted on the wood planking. Aircraft remained on the deck and in the hangar, frozen in time. The discovery brought closure to survivors who'd watched their ship sink in May 1942. Lady Lex had been found. She'd been waiting in the darkness all along, 3,000 meters down, in the sea that bore her battle's name. The Battle of the Coral Sea occupies a strange position in historical memory, simultaneously crucial and forgotten. For Americans, it was quickly overshadowed by the Battle of Midway 1 month later, which produced more decisive results and clearer victory. Midway became the famous turning point, celebrated in films and books, taught in schools. Coral Sea became a footnote, mentioned briefly as a preliminary action before the main event. This historical neglect does disservice to the battle's significance. Coral Sea was the first carrier versus carrier battle in history. The first time naval combat was conducted entirely by aircraft, without surface ships ever sighting each other. Every carrier battle afterward, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, followed the template established at Coral Sea. The doctrine, tactics, and lessons that emerged from those desperate May days in 1942 shaped the rest of the Pacific War's carrier operations. First doesn't always mean most important, but in this case it did. The strategic balance sheet reveals Coral Sea's true significance beyond tactical accounting. The battle stopped Japanese southern expansion permanently. After May 8, 1942, Japan never again threatened Port Moresby by sea. The subsequent land campaign over the Kokoda Track was a desperate last attempt to achieve by jungle warfare what had been denied at sea. Port Moresby remained allied, Australia remained secure, and the entire Southwest Pacific became a platform for American counteroffensive. Without Coral Sea, MacArthur's strategy of advancing through New Guinea toward the Philippines would have been impossible. Without Coral Sea, the Guadalcanal campaign 6 months later couldn't have been supplied or supported. Without Coral Sea, Australia might have been isolated or invaded, fundamentally altering Allied global strategy. The battle's strategic consequences rippled outward in ways that affected every subsequent Pacific operation. The human cost of achieving these strategic objectives must be remembered alongside the strategic analysis. 1,730 men died at Coral Sea, 656 Americans, 1,074 Japanese. Each was an individual with family, friends, dreams, and futures that ended in fire or water or crushing steel. The 216 men who died aboard Lexington included teenagers on their first deployment and veterans with 20 years of service. The 638 men who went down with Shoho included pilots who'd attacked Pearl Harbor and mechanics who'd maintained aircraft through 6 months of constant operations. The crew of Sims, destroyed in the mistaken attack that cost 379 lives, died because a scout pilot misidentified their ship. The crew of Neosho, drifting for 4 days before rescue, died from wounds, dehydration, sun exposure, or simply giving up hope. War is often discussed in terms of strategy, tactics, and outcomes, but it's experienced in terms of individual suffering, loss, and sacrifice. Coral Sea's importance cannot be measured only in strategic objectives achieved. It must also be measured in the price paid by those who fought it. The lessons learned at Coral Sea transformed carrier warfare from theory into proven practice. Before Coral Sea, carriers were powerful but untested in combat against peer opponents. After Coral Sea, everyone understood that carrier battles were deadly encounters where both sides would likely suffer severe damage. The side that struck first had an advantage, but even devastating first strikes rarely destroyed the enemy's ability to counterattack. Defense mattered as much as offense. Combat air patrol, anti-aircraft fire, damage control all proved essential to survival. Finding the enemy before they found you could determine the battle's outcome. Intelligence provided by code breakers was as important as any tactical decision made by commanders. These lessons were written in burning ships and drowning men, purchased at prices measured in hundreds of lives. But they were learned thoroughly, incorporated into doctrine, and applied in subsequent battles with increasing effectiveness. The technological and tactical evolution that followed Coral Sea proceeded directly from the battle's revelations. American carriers built after Coral Sea incorporated better damage control systems, improved fuel vapor detection, enhanced compartmentalization, more effective anti-aircraft batteries, better radar systems, improved communications equipment. Fighter tactics evolved from individual combat to team-based mutual support. Strike doctrine developed standardized coordination between dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. Damage control training became intensive and continuous. Pilot training expanded to produce thousands of aviators who learned from veterans' experience. Japanese forces made some similar improvements but couldn't match the pace of American innovation due to resource constraints, and cultural resistance to admitting that doctrine needed fundamental revision. By 1944, American carrier operations bore little resemblance to the desperate improvised operations at Coral Sea. The evolution was complete, and it began in May 1942. The debate over whether Coral Sea was an American victory or a Japanese victory has consumed historians for decades, but the debate somewhat misses the point. Tactical results favored Japan. They sank more tonnage, inflicted more casualties, lost only one light carrier versus America's fleet carrier. Strategic results favored America. Operation Mo failed. Port Moresby remained Allied, Australia was secure, and Japanese southward expansion ended permanently. Both things can be true simultaneously. Japan won the tactical exchange but lost the strategic campaign. For military historians, this creates an interesting case study in how tactical and strategic outcomes can diverge. For contemporary commanders in May 1942, it created confusion about what lessons to learn. Japanese commanders could claim victory and feel vindicated, reinforcing flawed doctrine. American commanders could acknowledge tactical defeat but recognize strategic success, creating pressure to improve tactics while maintaining strategic approach. This divergence may have actually helped America adapt faster than Japan, because American commanders knew they'd gotten lucky and needed to improve, while Japanese commanders believed their approach had worked and required only minor refinement. The commemoration of Coral Sea reveals much about how different nations remember their history. In Australia, Coral Sea Day on May 8th is an official day of remembrance, with ceremonies at the Australian War Memorial and other locations, honoring both American and Australian personnel. Australian Navy ships participate in ceremonies at sea near the battle's location when possible. Schools teach the battle's significance. Veterans are honored. The battle is remembered as the moment Australia's survival was secured. In America, by contrast, Coral Sea receives minimal official recognition. May 8th passes without major ceremonies. Few Americans know that the battle occurred or understand its significance. This disparity reflects different national experiences. For Australia, Coral Sea was existentially important. For America, it was one battle among many in a global war. Neither perspective is wrong, but they illuminate how national narratives shape historical memory. The final accounting of Coral Sea's place in history must weigh multiple factors. It was the first carrier battle, teaching lessons that shaped all subsequent carrier warfare. It stopped Japanese expansion, creating the strategic foundation for Allied counteroffensive. It demonstrated that intelligence advantages could offset material disadvantages. It revealed that attrition warfare favored the nation with greater industrial capacity. It showed that tactical defeats could produce strategic victories. It cost thousands of lives to purchase these lessons and outcomes. Whether all this made it a turning point depends on how we define turning points. If a turning point is a single moment where everything changed dramatically, then Midway deserves that label more than Coral Sea. But if a turning point is a moment where the trajectory begins to shift, where momentum is arrested and reversal becomes possible, then Coral Sea qualifies completely. After Coral Sea, Japan never regained the initiative. Every subsequent operation was reactive, defensive, or attempted to recover what had been lost. The war's momentum shifted in May 1942 in the Coral Sea, even if the dramatic reversal came at Midway in June. The ultimate legacy of the Battle of the Coral Sea is that it made all subsequent Allied victories possible. Without Coral Sea, there would have been no Midway ambush because Yorktown would have been in dry dock, and intelligence advantage wouldn't have been established. Without Coral Sea, there would have been no Guadalcanal campaign because Australia would have been threatened and unable to serve as a secure base. Without Coral Sea, the entire Pacific War's trajectory would have been different, longer, bloodier, more uncertain in outcome. The battle deserves to be remembered not just as the first carrier duel, though that alone would make it historically significant. It deserves to be remembered as the battle that saved Australia, enabled Midway, began the Pacific War's long turn toward Allied victory, and established the doctrinal foundation for carrier warfare that dominated the rest of the conflict. For the men who fought it, for the ships that were lost, for the strategic consequences that rippled forward, through years of war, the Battle of the Coral Sea was not a footnote. It was a foundation. And Lady Lex, resting 3,000 meters down in the sea that bears her battle's name, stands as an eternal monument to the price paid and the victory won.